Welcome to another video on stories of our history. In the oppressive, cathedral-like silence of a Frankish forest in the late summer of 866 CE, the heavy, iron-clad cavalry of the Carolingian Empire, the most powerful military machine in Europe, was being systematically and quietly dismantled by an enemy they could barely see. The forest, a dense, primeval expanse of oak, beech, and hornbeam that stretched for hundreds of miles across the region of Neustria, was not merely the backdrop for a battle but the battle's primary instrument, a living, breathing weapon that the Norse commanders had studied and mastered over decades of hit-and-run raiding. The Franks, under the command of Robert the Strong, the Margrave of the Breton March and the most effective defender of the Seine and Loire valleys against the Viking incursions, had cornered a large raiding force under the leadership of a chieftain whose name has been lost to history but whose tactical genius would, on this day, alter the course of the Frankish resistance. The Vikings, outnumbered by a formidable force of mounted and armored soldiers, had not fled to their ships as the Franks had expected. Instead, they had retreated deep into the woods, drawing the heavy Frankish cavalry into a labyrinth of narrow, sunken lanes, tangled undergrowth, and treacherous, swampy defile where the numerical superiority of the Imperials was nullified and their heavy armor became a suffocating, exhausting liability. The Annals of St. Bertin, the official chronicle of the Carolingian court, records the catastrophe with a terse, horrified precision. The Franks, pursuing the heathens with the blind confidence of a superior force, were lured into a village where the Vikings had barricaded themselves inside a stone church, and from the surrounding woods, a hidden reserve of Norse warriors fell upon the disorganized Frankish rear, slaughtering the horsemen who were trapped in the narrow, corpse-choked streets of a settlement that had become a pre-designed killing box. The disaster that unfolded at Brissarthe on the banks of the river Sarthe was not the result of a cowardly, unchivalrous ambush. It was the execution of a perfectly planned and brutally efficient guerrilla operation that revealed the profound asymmetry of the conflict between the Scandinavian raiders and the continental kingdoms. The myth of the Viking as a straightforward, head-on warrior of the open field, a man who lived and died by the shield wall and the berserker charge, is one of the most enduring and misleading caricatures of the medieval world, a caricature that was carefully cultivated by the monastic chroniclers who were the primary historians of the age but which collapses under the weight of a more careful military historical analysis. The vast majority of the Viking Age's most stunning and strategically significant victories were not won in the pitched, set-piece battles that dominate the narrative of the sagas and the chronicles, but in the sudden, silent, and utterly devastating ambuscades that the Norse commanders orchestrated in the forests, the marshes, and the narrow river valleys of the territories they plundered. The Norse herner, the art of war, was, at its highest level of execution, a form of ecological warfare, a method of fighting that treated the landscape not as a static, passive environment but as a dynamic, lethal participant in the conflict. A weapon that could be wielded with the same precision and the same devastating effect as the sword and the axe. The guerrilla tactics of the Vikings, the smyglstr, the hidden war, as it might have been called in the Old Norse, were not a desperate improvisation of a technologically inferior force but a sophisticated, deeply considered, and culturally transmitted body of tactical knowledge that was rooted in the Scandinavian terrain itself, a terrain of dense, mountainous forests, narrow, cliff-bound fjords, and countless, labyrinthine islands that had trained the Northmen in the art of the ambush. Since the earliest days of the Iron Age, the Viking chieftains who led the raids on Francia, England, and Ireland were not merely lucky, charismatic pirates. They were, in many cases, master practitioners of a form of asymmetric warfare that would not be fully theorized until the 20th century, a form of warfare that transformed the mobile, sea-borne raider into a phantom, a terror of the woods, a predator who used the land as his primary weapon, his primary intelligence network, and his primary escape route. The terror that the Viking guerrilla warrior inspired in his enemies was a specific, carefully cultivated psychological weapon, a terror that was rooted in the radical violation of the expectations of honorable, Christian combat, and that was as effective at destroying the enemy's morale as the axe was at destroying his body. The Frankish and Anglo-Saxon military aristocracies, trained in the traditions of the late Roman and Carolingian warfare, understood battle as a structured, seasonal affair of massed infantry and cavalry, a contest of honor and God's favor that was conducted in the open field under the gaze of the heavenly and earthly lords. The Vikings, by contrast, operated with a complete, amoral disregard for these conventions, attacking at night, in the mist, during the storms, and from the impenetrable cover of the forests and the swamps, a form of warfare that the Christian chroniclers could only interpret as a manifestation of the demonic, the heathen, the uncivilized. The Annals of St. Bertin, in its entry for the year 845 C, describes the Northmen as emerging from the darkness of the woods like a swarm of infernal locusts, striking and vanishing before the hand of the Christian could be raised against them. A phrase that captures the essential, psychological component of the guerrilla terror, the invisibility, the suddenness, and the profound, unsettling sense that the very landscape had become hostile, that the trees themselves were the spies and the allies of the heathen. The Viking ambush was not merely a tactical maneuver. It was a form of psychological warfare that sought to shatter the enemy's confidence in his ability to control the ground, to turn the simple act of marching through a forest into a prolonged, exhausting, and deeply terrifying ordeal of constant, unseen threat, an ordeal that could, and frequently did, break the spirit of an army long before the first axe was thrown. The specific tactical repertoire of the Viking guerrilla warrior was a flexible, adaptable, and constantly evolving set of techniques that were tailored to the specific terrain, the specific enemy, and the specific objectives of the raid, a repertoire that was transmitted orally, through the apprenticeship of the young warrior to the veteran chieftain. And that was encoded in the skaldic verses and the saga narratives that preserved the memory of the great ambushes. The most basic, and the most frequently employed, of these techniques was the heimsøken, the home attack, the sudden, pre-dawn descent upon a sleeping village or monastery, a tactic that exploited the cover of darkness and the element of surprise to overwhelm the defenders before they could organize any effective resistance, a tactic that was, in its essence, a form of ambush. A trap that used the darkness itself as the concealment. The more complex and the more militarily significant technique was the umfer, the surrounding ambush, the classic L-shaped or horseshoe-shaped trap that was laid along a road or a riverbank, in which the enemy column was allowed to advance into a pre-selected killing zone, its front and rear blocked by felled trees or a sudden, barricaded wall, and its flanks then assaulted by a hidden force of archers, javelin throwers, and shock infantry who burst from the cover of the trees and the undergrowth. The third, and the most psychologically devastating, was the false flight, the flådesvik, a tactic that was employed with a consummate, theatrical skill by the Norse commanders, in which a small, exposed force would engage the enemy, feign a panicked retreat, and draw the pursuing Franks or Anglo-Saxons deep into the prepared, fatal terrain of the ambush. A tactic that required an iron discipline and a perfect coordination between the bait and the hidden, waiting wolves, a tactic that the Frankish heavy cavalry, with its doctrinal commitment to the aggressive, headlong charge, was almost pathologically incapable of resisting. The legacy of the Viking guerrilla warfare is a legacy that has been largely obscured by the more dramatic, more easily romanticized images of the shield wall and the berserker, but it is a legacy that is, in many respects, the more enduring and the more historically significant of the two. The territories that were permanently conquered and settled by the Northmen, the Danelaw in England, the Duchy of Normandy in France, the Norse Gaelic kingdoms of Ireland and the Scottish Isles, were not won by the head-on, climactic battle alone but by a patient, multi-generational campaign of raid, ambush, and the slow, relentless erosion of the enemy's ability to control the countryside. The guerrilla war, the hidden war, was the long, grinding, and utterly essential campaign that broke the back of the Carolingian military power in the Loire and Seine valleys, that wore down the resistance of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and that allowed the small, mobile bands of Norse raiders to paralyze and eventually conquer territories that were vastly larger, more populous, and more heavily armored than their own. The forest phantoms, the shadow warriors of the north, were the true architects of the Viking Age, the patient, silent, and utterly lethal specialists of the hidden war, and their story, the story of the land as a weapon, is one of the most remarkable and the most overlooked chapters of the entire medieval military history. The terrain of the Scandinavian homelands, the rocky, forested, and deeply indented landscape of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, was the primary and the most influential teacher of the guerrilla tactics that the Vikings would later employ with such devastating effect on the continent. The basic geography of the north, a geography of immense, near vertical fjords, dense, trackless forests of pine and birch, and countless, rocky islands and skerries, was a geography that, from the earliest Iron Age, had made the pitched, set-piece battle a rare and often disastrous anomaly and had, instead, elevated the ambush, the raid, and the stealthy, nighttime attack to the primary forms of intertribal warfare. The fylki, the petty kingdoms of pre-Viking Norway, were separated from each other by the great mountain ranges of the Kiel, the Jotunheimen, and the Dovrefjell, and the narrow, habitable strips of land along the fjords were connected only by a network of steep, narrow paths, the Klavveger, that were ideal for the ambush and utterly unsuited to the deployment of any large, organized force. The young Norwegian warrior, the Bondi's son who would one day sail to Francia, learned the art of the hidden war not from a military manual but from the harsh, daily experience of the interclan feud, the Edvig, a form of conflict that was conducted in the dense birch forests and the narrow, mist-shrouded valleys of the home fylke, a conflict in which the ability to move silently, to read the subtle, natural signs of the enemy's passage, and to strike from a concealed position with a sudden, overwhelming violence was the difference between the survival and the annihilation of the family. The dense, old-growth forests of Scandinavia, the Mørkjarvir, the dark woods of the Norse sagas, were not merely a source of timber and game but a sacred, liminal space that was, in the Norse imagination, the dwelling place of the trolls, the Vader, and the outlaws, a realm of constant, unseen danger that trained the hunter and the warrior in a hyper-vigilant, hyper-observant mode of being. The hogspjot, the throwing spear, and the bogey, the bow, weapons that could be deployed from behind a tree or a rock and that did not require the close quarters, shield wall formation, were the primary weapons of the forest ambush, and the archaeological record of the pre-Viking and Viking Age graves, particularly in the mountainous regions of Uppland and Telemark, shows a consistent, regional preference for these ranged, ambush-oriented weapons over the heavy, infantry swords and axes that dominated the open field combat. The young warrior, trained from the age of 7 or 8 in the art of the hunt, learned to move through the underbrush without snapping a twig, to read the flight of the disturbed birds that signaled the approach of an enemy, to recognize the faint, almost invisible traces of a recent human passage, and to wait, motionless and utterly silent, for hours or even days, for the perfect moment to launch a single, killing javelin or arrow. A skill set that was directly and lethally transferable to the forests of Neustria, the swamps of the Danelaw, and the bogs of Ireland. The forest, in the Scandinavian military tradition, was not an obstacle but a home, a familiar, friendly, and infinitely manipulable environment that the Norse warrior understood with an intimacy that his continental enemies, the men of the open fields and the Roman roads, could never hope to match. The social and legal structure of the pre-Viking and Viking Age Scandinavian society further reinforced the guerrilla mode of warfare, for the Bondi, the free farmer, was not a full-time soldier but a part-time warrior, a man who spent the majority of the year working his land, tending his cattle, and managing his farm, and who could only be mobilized for a short, intensive, and usually local campaign during the summer months. The Leingr, the naval levy that was later formalized by the medieval kings, had its origins in this seasonal, part-time warrior system, a system that was, by its very nature, unsuited to the prolonged, attritional siege warfare and the large-scale, pitched battles of the continental states, and that was, instead, perfectly adapted to the fast, mobile, and highly destructive raid, the Viking. A form of warfare that could be conducted with a small, well-trained band of neighbors and kinsmen. Over a period of a few weeks, a raid that relied on the speed of the Longship, the surprise of the night attack, and the lethality of the forest ambush to achieve its economic and political objectives. The chieftain, the Hersir, who led such an expedition was not a king with a standing army but a first among equals, a man whose authority was based on his personal hamingja, luck, his reputation for the just division of the plunder, and his demonstrated skill in the art of the hidden war. A skill that he had learned, as a young man, in the forests and the fjords of his home district, a skill that he would now apply. With a terrifying, adaptive genius to the very different but equally exploitable terrains of Francia, England, and Ireland. The specific, technical skills of the forest ambush were transmitted and preserved through an oral tradition of tactical instruction, a body of knowledge that was encoded in the skaldic verses, the Draper and the Losavizor, that celebrated the deeds of the great chieftains, and in the sagas, the Islandingasogur, that recounted the stories of the settlement and the feuds, and that, when read with a military eye, reveal a remarkably detailed and sophisticated understanding of the principles of the ambush, the trap, and the hit and run. The Egil saga, the story of the warrior poet Egil Skallagrimsson, is a particularly rich source, for it contains a number of vividly described episodes of forest warfare, including a classic ambush in which Egil and his small band of men, hiding in the dense woods of the island of Atloy, launch a sudden, nighttime attack on a superior force of the king's men, killing many of them and escaping into the darkness. A narrative that is, in its bare, tactical essentials, a manual of the Viking hit and run. The saga's account of the ambush at the Skogarbrunn, the forest's edge, emphasizes the careful, pre-reconnoitered selection of the killing ground, the use of the darkness and the terrain to mask the approach, the sudden, concentrated violence of the initial assault, and the immediate, disciplined withdrawal before the enemy could recover. A sequence of actions that is the timeless, universal blueprint of the successful guerrilla operation, a blueprint that the Norse chieftains, through the sagas and the oral tradition, carried in their memories and applied, with a lethal, adaptive flexibility, to the battlefields of Europe. The most famous, and the most historically significant, example of the false flight in the Viking Age is the series of ambushes that were conducted by the great heathen army during its campaign of conquest in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria in the years 866–867 CE, a campaign that culminated in the capture of the city of York and the destruction of the Northumbrian king, Guerrilla, and his rival Osbert, a campaign that was, in its strategic and tactical essence, a sustained, multi-phased guerrilla operation that used the terrain of the Yorkshire wolds and the Pennine foothills to draw the Northumbrian forces into a series of carefully prepared, fatal traps. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that the great army, having landed in East Anglia and secured its horses, marched north into Northumbria, a kingdom that was, at that moment, paralyzed by a bitter, internal civil war between the two rival kings, Alla and Osbert, a civil war that the Viking commanders, the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless and Ub, had been carefully monitoring and were now expertly exploiting. The Viking army, instead of advancing directly on the heavily fortified city of York, which was the capital of the Northumbrian kingdom, conducted a series of provocative, hit-and-run raids across the countryside, burning the villages, sacking the monasteries, and drawing the two, now hastily reconciled, Northumbrian kings and their respective armies into a headlong, poorly coordinated pursuit. A pursuit that was precisely, the false flight that the Viking commanders had planned. The Northumbrian army, a mixed force of thanes and their household warriors, the FYRD, was lured deep into the narrow, constricted valley of the River Derwent, a terrain that was dominated by the dense, ancient forest of the Yorkshire wolds, a forest that was, to the Northumbrian farmers and thanes, a strange, hostile, and terrifying wilderness, but which was, to the Scandinavian forest warriors, a familiar, friendly, and infinitely exploitable killing ground. The result, on the 21st of March 867 CE, was the catastrophic, annihilating ambush that the Chronicle records with the grim, terse finality of the total defeat. Both the Northumbrian kings were killed, the flower of the Northumbrian nobility was slaughtered, and the city of York, now utterly defenseless, was taken and occupied by the great army. A victory that was won not by the shield wall but by the forest, the false flight, and the patient, lethal silence of the wolf pack. The dense, sprawling, and strategically vital forest of the Ardennes, which stretched across the borders of modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France, was, throughout the 9th century, one of the most heavily exploited and the most tactically significant theaters of the Viking guerrilla war, a vast, trackless, and deeply intimidating wilderness that the Norse raiders used as a base of operations, a refuge of retreat, and a virtually inexhaustible source of the ambush and the hit and run. The Ardennes, with its steep, forested ridges, its narrow, deeply incised river valleys, its countless, hidden springs and marshes, and its ancient, tangled, and almost impenetrable undergrowth, was a terrain that was singularly unsuited to the heavy, slow-moving, and road-bound armies of the Carolingian Empire, and it was, for the same reasons, a terrain that was perfectly suited to the small, mobile, and self-sufficient bands of Viking raiders who had learned the art of the forest war in the similar, though colder and more mountainous, terrains of the Scandinavian homelands. The Frankish chronicles of the period, such as the Annals of St. Bertin and the Annals of Fulda, are filled with the complaints and the laments of the Carolingian commanders, who found that the Northmen, having established a hidden, fortified camp in the heart of the Ardennes, could strike out, without warning, at the rich, vulnerable monasteries of the Meuse and the Moselle valleys, and then vanish, in a matter of hours, back into the impenetrable, silent darkness of the great forest, a forest that the Franks, with their heavy cavalry and their road-bound logistics, were utterly incapable of penetrating or controlling. The Ardennes, in the 9th century, was the Vikings' green hell, a green hell that was, for the Frankish knight, a place of constant, gnawing, and utterly debilitating terror, a place where every shadow, every bird call, and every rustle of the leaves was a potential, unseen, and instantaneously fatal threat. The strategic importance of the Ardennes as a base of operations for the Viking fleets that operated on the rivers of the Meuse, the Moselle, and the Rhine cannot be overstated, for the forests provided a secure, concealed, and essentially unassailable refuge from which the raiders could dominate the entire, vast network of the Frankish inland waterways. The liquid highways that were the economic and the military arteries of the Carolingian state. The Viking longship, with its extremely shallow draft of less than a meter, was capable of navigating far up the smallest, most winding tributaries of the great rivers, deep into the heart of the Ardennes, where a hidden, sheltered cove on a forested riverbank could serve as a temporary, virtually undetectable base for a raiding party of 100 or more warriors. The Frankish authorities, who were dependent on the old, Roman network of the paved roads and the heavily fortified bridges for their military movements, found that the Viking fleet, which could move with a speed and a silence that was utterly impossible for the land-bound forces, was essentially an invisible, omnipresent threat, a threat that could materialize, without warning, at any point along the hundreds of miles of the riverbanks, sack a monastery, a royal estate, or a merchant settlement, and then vanish, in the space of a single night, back into the labyrinthine, forested waterways of the Ardennes. The forest, in this context, was not merely a passive, hiding place but an active, strategic weapon, a weapon that multiplied the speed, the surprise, and the psychological terror of the Viking raid by a factor that the road-bound, cavalry-dependent Frankish commanders could neither understand nor effectively counter. The specific, tactical methods that the Vikings employed in the Ardennes theater of operations were adapted, with a characteristic, pragmatic intelligence, to the unique, dense, and heavily vegetated terrain of the old-growth forest, a terrain that required a set of skills and a mode of movement that were radically different from the open-field tactics of the shield wall. The Viking raider in the Ardennes moved on foot, not on horseback, and he traveled light, carrying only his weapons, a small, iron ration of the dried meat and the hard bread, and a water skin, a load that allowed him to move, for hours or even days, through the most dense, trackless, and mountainous parts of the forest, a form of movement that the heavily armored, horse-dependent Frankish knight, with his squires, his baggage train, and his massive, grain-fed destrier, could not hope to emulate. The Norse warrior's primary weapon in the forest ambush was not the heavy, two-handed axe that was so devastating in the open field, but the lighter, more versatile, and more easily thrown caspjot, the javelin, and the bogey, the bow, weapons that could be deployed from behind the cover of a massive oak or a granite boulder, that could be used to kill the enemy from a distance of 30 or 40 meters. And that could be rapidly, silently reloaded and redeployed from the cover of the forest. A tactic that allowed a small, dispersed band of a dozen warriors to pin down, demoralize, and slowly, methodically annihilate a much larger, but road-bound and heavily armored, Frankish patrol. The forest, in the hands of the skilled Viking Skogarmar, forest man, became a vast, three-dimensional killing ground, a ground in which the enemy, the heavy, clanking, and highly visible Frankish knight, was the prey, and the silent, invisible, and utterly patient Norse warrior was the predator, a predator who could strike, at the moment of his choosing, from the shadows, and who could, in an instant, melt back into the green, impenetrable silence of the woods. The psychological impact of the Viking Ardennes campaign on the local population, the peasant farmers, the monks, and the small, isolated communities of the forest clearings, was a terror of a particularly intimate, personal, and devastating kind, a terror that was not the sudden, mass shock of the shield wall but the slow, grinding, and utterly demoralizing fear of the invisible, omnipresent threat. The fear that the heathens were watching, waiting, from the dark, silent depths of the forest. And that they could, at any moment, emerge, without warning, to burn the village, to slaughter the men, and to take the women and the children as slaves to the waiting longships on the hidden river. The monastic chronicles of the region, such as the Gesta of the abbots of St. Hubert in the Ardennes, preserve the vivid, traumatized memory of this period, a period of decades in which the monks lived in a constant, paralyzing fear of the Northmen, a fear that forced them to fortify their monasteries, to hide their sacred relics and their silver in the deep, secret caves of the forest, and to maintain a permanent, anxious watch from the newly constructed bell towers and the lookout posts. The forest phantoms, by their mastery of the Ardennes, had, in effect, conquered and occupied, not the physical territory of the forest, but the psychological territory of the minds of the people who lived on its edges, a psychological occupation that was as effective, as enduring, and as deeply damaging to the Frankish state as any physical, territorial conquest could have been. The ultimate, strategic consequence of the Viking exploitation of the Ardennes was the effective, permanent severance of the vital, east-west lines of communication and trade that connected the two great halves of the Carolingian Empire, the western kingdom of Charles the Bald and the eastern kingdom of Louis the German, a severance that contributed, decisively, to the fragmentation, the paralysis, and the eventual collapse of the imperial, Frankish state. The rich, commercial monasteries of the Meuse Valley, such as the great abbeys of Stavelot, Malmedy, and Prum, which had been, for centuries, the nodes of a vast, continental network of trade, pilgrimage, and royal patronage were, in the course of the 9th century, repeatedly sacked, burned, and abandoned, their monks driven into exile, their libraries and their treasures dispersed or destroyed, and their economic function as the engines of the regional economy permanently and devastatingly impaired. The Ardennes, which had once been a peaceful, sacred, and economically productive region of the Frankish heartland, had been transformed by the guerrilla war of the Northmen into a lawless, depopulated, and deeply terrifying wilderness, a no-man's land that marked the effective, internal frontier of the collapsing Carolingian state, a frontier that was the visible, tangible, and tragic monument to the tactical genius and the strategic patience of the forest phantoms. The swamps, the marshes, and the vast, waterlogged fenlands of the Low Countries, the Rhine Delta, and the eastern English shires were, alongside the forests, the second great, natural laboratory of the Viking guerrilla war, a terrain that the Norse warriors, with their unique, amphibious capabilities, adapted to and exploited with a mastery that was as terrifying as it was complete. The Low Countries, the modern-day Netherlands and the Flanders region of Belgium were, in the 9th century, a vast, flat, and largely undefended labyrinth of the rivers, the tidal estuaries, the peat bogs, and the reed-choked, shallow meres, a terrain that was, to the heavy, road-bound Frankish cavalry, an impassable, sucking, and utterly treacherous morass, but which was, to the shallow draft, highly maneuverable Viking longship, a liquid highway, a secret, hidden network of the water paths that allowed the Norse raiders to penetrate, silently and unseen, deep into the heart of the Frankish Empire. The raids on the Frisian coast, the repeated, devastating sacks of the great trading emporium of Dorstad on the Rhine, and the long, sustained campaigns of the Viking chieftains Rorik and Godfred in the Rhine Delta, were not conducted, primarily, by the open field, shield wall battles that dominate the popular image of the Viking Age, but by a patient, methodical. An immensely profitable form of the amphibious guerrilla war, a war that used the tides, the fogs, and the countless, hidden, choked channels of the delta to launch the sudden, overwhelming, and utterly unexpected hit-and-run raids on the unsuspecting Frankish garrisons and towns. The tactical adaptation of the longship to the specific, demanding conditions of the swamp and the fenland was a remarkable, and largely unappreciated, feat of the naval engineering and the maritime skill, a feat that transformed the Viking fleet into a true, amphibious, all-terrain weapons system. The standard Viking Snekja, a ship of about 17 meters in length, with a beam of just over 2.5 meters, and a draft, when fully loaded with a crew of 40 warriors, of less than 90 centimeters, was capable of navigating the watercourses that were too shallow, too narrow, and too obstructed for any other vessel of the period, a capability that allowed the Norse fleet to penetrate, unseen and unheard, up the smallest, most insignificant, and most heavily vegetated of the fenland creeks, the Fleet and the Merk, to disembark a raiding party on a dry, hidden patch of the solid ground, and to launch a sudden, devastating, and completely surprise attack on a monastery or a village that was many miles from the open sea. The Viking crews, who were the masters of the tide and the current, would time their movements to coincide with the high spring tides, which would carry their longships deep into the heart of the marshland, and they would then, at the flood, conceal their vessels in the dense, impenetrable stands of the reed and the willow, a natural camouflage that was, to the untrained, land-bound eye of the Frankish scout, utterly indistinguishable from the surrounding, featureless swamp. The longship, in this fenland mode of operation, was not merely a transport but a mobile, stealthy, and virtually undetectable base of operations, a floating, hidden camp that could be moved, from one raid to the next, across a vast, interconnected, and utterly unguardable network of the waterways, a network that the Frankish defenders, who were dependent on the few, narrow, and heavily fortified causeways and bridges, could never hope to control. The specific, hit-and-run tactics of the Viking swamp war were a dark, wet, and claustrophobic mirror of the forest ambush, a set of techniques that exploited the unique, isolating, and disorienting properties of the marshland to separate, trap, and annihilate the pursuing Frankish forces. The Norse raiders, having sacked a monastery or a town on the edge of the fen, would retreat, not to the open sea, but deeper into the swamp, drawing the enraged, heavily armored Frankish cavalry, under the command of some local comes or misses, into a terrain that the Vikings had carefully reconnoitered and prepared, a terrain of the hidden, deep water channels, the sudden, sucking patches of the liquid peat, and the narrow, winding, and constantly shifting paths of the solid ground that were known only to the local, fenland fishermen and the Norse scouts. The Frankish heavy cavalry, their horses sinking to their hocks in the soft, black mire, their armor and their weapons becoming a lethal, drowning burden, their formation dissolving into a chaotic, scattered, and utterly vulnerable mass of the isolated, struggling men, would then be assaulted, from the cover of the reed beds and the willow cars, by a swarm of the lightly armed, fast-moving, and swamp-adapted Viking warriors. Men who fought on foot, with the javelin and the short, stabbing spear, and who moved, with a sure-footed, silent agility, across the treacherous, waterlogged terrain that was a death trap for the Frankish knight. The swamp ambush, like the forest ambush, was a complete, one-sided, and utterly annihilating victory, a victory that left the bloated, unrecognizable bodies of the Frankish aristocracy to be discovered, days or weeks later, by the horrified, local peasants, a grim, silent, and deeply terrifying monument to the lethal, unnatural power of the Northmen over the water and the land. The psychological dimension of the Viking swamp war, the terror that the Northmen inspired in the inhabitants of the Low Countries, was a terror that was rooted, not merely in the sudden, violent death of the raid, but in a deeper, more existential fear of the water itself, a fear of the slow, silent, and inexorable drowning of the land, a fear that the heathens, with their uncanny, amphibious powers, were not merely the human enemies but the agents, the servants, of the hostile, submarine forces that were slowly, patiently, and irresistibly swallowing the coastal world. The Frankish chronicles of the period, such as the Annals of St. are filled with the accounts of the high, freak tides, the massive, destructive storm surges, and the slow, creeping inundation of the coastal farmlands, all of which were interpreted by the terrified, superstitious population as the signs of the divine displeasure, a displeasure that was embodied, in the human world, by the pagan, amphibious Northmen, the FL men, the flood men, who moved, with a terrifying, unnatural ease, across the boundary that separated the land from the sea. The swamp, the fen, and the tidal estuary were, in the Christian, medieval imagination, the liminal spaces, the thresholds of the demonic, the places where the order of the human, the dry, and the sacred dissolved into the chaos of the monster, the wet, and the profane, and the Viking raiders, by their mastery of these spaces, had tapped into a deep, primal, and profoundly destabilizing vein of the psychological terror, a terror that was as effective, as enduring, and as historically significant as any of the tactical, military victories they achieved in the field. The long-term, strategic consequence of the Viking swamp war in the Low Countries was the permanent, and essentially total, destruction of the Frisian trading economy, a destruction that was a major, contributing factor to the decline of the Carolingian monetary system and the fragmentation of the imperial, economic unity. The great emporium of Dorstad, on the Rhine, which had been, in the early 9th century, the single most important mint and the commercial hub of the entire northern Frankish Empire, was sacked and burned annually, from 834 to 837 CE, and then repeatedly, again, in the 840s and 850s, a systematic, methodical, and utterly devastating campaign of the hit-and-run amphibious raids that effectively, and permanently, destroyed the city's capacity to function as a center of the international trade. The silver pennies of Dorstad, which had been the standard currency of the Northern European exchange, ceased to be minted, and the minting activity, along with the merchant community, fled south, to the more defensible, inland towns of the Meuse and the Scheldt, a migration that permanently shifted the economic center of gravity of the Low Countries and that left the once rich, coastal region of Frisia a depopulated, impoverished, and economically marginal backwater. The forest phantoms, by their amphibious, swamp-based guerrilla war, had not merely stolen the silver and the slaves of the Frisian coasts, they had, in a very real and a very permanent sense, drowned the economic heart of the northern Frankish state, a victory that was, in its long-term, structural consequence, as complete, as decisive, and as irreversible as any victory that was ever won on the open field of the battle. The Viking campaigns in Ireland, which began with the first, recorded raids on the island in the late 8th century and which evolved, over the course of the 9th and 10th centuries, into a prolonged, brutal, and deeply complex conflict of the raid, the settlement, and the internecine alliance, were, in their tactical essence, a sustained, multi-generational guerrilla war, a war that was fought, not on the open, rolling plains of the central Midlands, but in the dark, trackless bogs, the dense, hazel scrub woodlands, and the narrow, hidden valleys of the Irish rivers. The Norse, who established a network of the fortified coastal bases, the Longforts, at the mouths of the major rivers, Dublin at the mouth of the Liffey, Waterford at the mouth of the Suir, Cork at the mouth of the Lee, and Limerick at the mouth of the Shannon, used these bases as the secure, logistical hubs from which they launched a continuous, and immensely destructive, series of the hit-and-run raids deep into the interior of the island, a campaign that was designed, not to conquer the territory in the conventional, territorial sense, but to extract the maximum, portable wealth, the silver, the gold, and above all, the slaves, from the rich, vulnerable, and politically fragmented network of the Irish monasteries and the petty kingdoms. The Irish Annals, the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of the Four Masters, and the Chronicle Scotorum are a brutal, unsparing record of this long, grinding war, a year-by-year litany of the burned abbeys, the slaughtered monks, the desecrated shrines, and the thousands, the tens of thousands, of the captive men, women, and children who were carried off to the slave markets of Dublin and the wider, Islamic and Byzantine worlds. A litany that is the testament to the tactical mastery of the Norse in the guerrilla exploitation of the Irish terrain. The Irish terrain itself, a patchwork of the vast, central, peat bog expanse, the dense, lowland woods of the oak and the hazel, and the countless, shallow, reed-choked lakes of the loughs, was a terrain that was, in many respects, ideally suited to the hit-and-run, amphibious raiding that the Vikings had perfected in the forests and the swamps of the continent, and the Norse long forts, which were established at the tidal limits of the great rivers, were the tactical keys that unlocked the entire interior geography of the island. A raiding party embarked in a fleet of the shallow draft, portable vessels, could leave Dublin on the morning tide, row and sail up the river Liffey, and then, by a series of the carefully reconnoitered portages, cross the low, central watershed into the vast, interconnected lake system of the River Shannon, the Cyane, the great, liquid highway that bisects the island from north to south, and that gave access to the richest, the most vulnerable, and the most heavily monasticized regions of the Midlands and the West. The Irish kings and their armies, which were composed, primarily, of the lightly armed, fast-moving, but unarmored infantry, the kern, and the small, elite, and highly mobile cavalry, were, in theory, well suited to the counter-insurgency, guerrilla warfare, and the Irish annals record a number of successful, ambush-based victories over the Norse raiding parties, victories that were achieved by the Irish chieftains who had learned, through a long, painful experience, to replicate the Norse tactics of the forest and the bog and to use the terrain against the previously invincible Northmen. However, the strategic, political fragmentation of the Irish landscape, the constant, internecine warfare between the dozens of the petty kingdoms and the over-kings, meant that the Irish response to the Norse incursion was never unified, never coordinated, and never sustained, and the Vikings, who were the masters of the political, as well as the military, intelligence, were able, with a ruthless, cynical pragmatism, to ally themselves with one Irish faction against another, to exploit the feuds and the rivalries of the native kings, and to maintain, and even expand, their coastal enclaves in the face of the chronic, and ultimately self-defeating, Irish resistance. The Battle of Clontarf, which was fought on the coast of Dublin on the 23rd of April 1014 C, is, in the popular, nationalist imagination, the great, climactic, and heroic victory of the Irish over the Viking oppressors, a pitched, set-piece battle in which the High King, Brian Boru, annihilated the combined Norse and Leinster army and, at the cost of his own life, broke the Norse power in Ireland forever. The saga accounts of the battle, particularly the Icelandic Njál's saga, are a rich, vivid, and deeply mythological tapestry of the portents, the omens, and the heroic, individual combats that surrounded the final, cataclysmic clash of the two civilizations. But a closer, more careful, and more militarily dispassionate reading of the battle reveals that Clontarf was not, in its tactical essence, a simple, head-on collision of the two shield walls but a complex, multi-phased, and deeply asymmetrical battle in which the terrain, the tidal, sandy flats of the River Tolka estuary, the dense, thorny hedgerows, and the narrow, constricted lanes of the coastal settlement, played a decisive, and often overlooked, role in the final, Irish victory. The Norse army, under the command of the Earl Sigurd of Orkney, was caught, at the low tide, on the open, sandy beach, a terrain that was completely exposed and that offered no cover, no protection, and no possibility of the maneuver, a death trap that Brian Boru's forces, which had occupied the higher, solid ground of the inland, were able to assault with a devastating, concentrated volley of the javelins and the arrows before the close quarters, shield wall combat began. The battle was, in its final, desperate phase, a brutal, grinding, and attritional struggle that was fought across the narrow, choked hedgerows and the drainage ditches of the coastal plain, a terrain that broke up the dense, Norse formations, that neutralized the advantage of the heavy, two-handed axe, and that allowed the more lightly armed, but more agile, Irish infantry to isolate and overwhelm the individual stranded Viking champions. Clontarf, the greatest, pitched battle of the Viking Age in Ireland, was, in its tactical and its topographic reality, a guerrilla ambush writ large, a trap that used the coastal terrain of the Dublin Bay to annihilate a Norse army that had been lured, strategically and tactically, into a position from which there was no escape, a position that was, in its essence, a killing ground that was as carefully prepared, as ruthlessly exploited, and as utterly decisive as any forest ambush in the Ardennes or any swamp trap in the Frisian fen. The long-term, structural legacy of the Viking guerrilla war in Ireland was not the conquest or the colonization of the island but the creation of a new, hybrid, and deeply militarized society, the Norse Gaelic culture of the coastal towns and the Scottish islands, a culture that was the product of the centuries of the raid, the trade, the intermarriage, and the mutual, if often hostile, exchange of the tactical and the political skills. The Irish, through their long, painful, and often costly interaction with the Norse, had learned, and had ultimately mastered, the arts of the amphibious raid, the forest ambush, and the hit-and-run attack, skills that they would, in the subsequent centuries, employ with a devastating, and highly mobile, effectiveness against the English and the Norman invaders, a tactical legacy that would culminate in the great guerrilla campaigns of the Irish chieftains of the 16th and the 17th centuries. The forest phantoms, by their long, brutal, and ultimately symbiotic war in the bogs and the woods of Ireland, had transmitted, through the slow, invisible, and utterly irreversible process of the cultural osmosis, the ancient, Scandinavian art of the hidden war to the native, Gaelic population, a transmission that was, in its long-term, historical consequence, one of the most enduring, and the most deeply paradoxical, of the many legacies of the Viking Age. The use of the traps, the engineered obstacles, and the pre-prepared, defensive positions was an integral, and the most physically labor-intensive, component of the Viking guerrilla repertoire, a component that transformed the natural, passive terrain of the forest and the swamp into an active, mechanically lethal killing ground, a ground that was sown with the hidden, iron-toothed jaws of the pitfall, the suspended, crushing weight of the deadfall log, and the sudden, impaling stakes of the trap. The Norse sagas, which are often dismissed as the unreliable, fanciful products of the later, Christian imagination, are, in fact, a rich, detailed, and technically precise repository of the memory of these traps, a memory that is encoded in the vivid, often horrific, narratives of the ambush and the pursuit, and that, when read with the eye of the military engineer, reveals a sophisticated and deeply practical understanding of the principles of the field fortification and the passive area denial defense. The Egil saga, for example, contains an account of a trap that the hero, Egil, employs during his campaign in the forests of Varmland, a trap in which a narrow, forest path is blocked by a felled tree, and the pursuing enemy, the men of a rival chieftain, are channeled by the obstacle into a pre-ranged, killing ground where a series of the hidden, sharpened stakes, the broader, have been driven into the soft, forest floor. Stakes that impale the feet and the legs of the advancing, unsuspecting warriors, a trap that is, in its essence, a prototypical version of the punji stake pit that would be used, with a devastating effectiveness, by the guerrilla forces of the 20th century. The saga, in its description of the trap, notes the specific, practical details. The stakes are cut from the hard, green wood of the birch, they are sharpened to a fine point, they are fire-hardened to increase their strength and their resistance to the rot, and they are concealed under a thin, carefully replaced layer of the forest litter, the leaves, and the moss. A level of the technical specificity that can only have originated in the actual, practiced, and transmitted experience of the forest guerrillas. The Ulfagraf, the wolf pit, was the most common, the most basic, and the most widely employed of the Viking traps, a simple, deep, and narrow hole, dug into the soil of a forest path or a riverbank, its bottom bristling with the sharpened, fire-hardened stakes, its mouth concealed by a light, fragile covering of the branches, the leaves, and the moss, a trap that was designed to cripple, to maim, and to demoralize the pursuing enemy, and that was, in its psychological effect, as much a weapon of the terror as a weapon of the physical destruction. The Annals of St. Bertin, in its account of the Frankish pursuit of a Viking raiding party in the Ardennes in 882 C, records that the Frankish knights, advancing along a narrow, sunken lane through the dense forest, suddenly, and without any warning, fell into a series of the hidden pits, the fovi of the Latin Chronicle, pits that were filled with the sharpened stakes and the iron hooks, and that many of the horses and the men were cruelly impaled and killed, and the rest, in a great fear, turned back and refused to advance any further. The wolf pit, in this account, was not merely a physical obstacle but a psychological, terror weapon, a weapon that shattered the confidence of the pursuing Franks, that destroyed their willingness to enter the forest, and that, in a single, brutally effective stroke, ended the pursuit and allowed the Viking raiding party, which had been on the verge of the destruction, to escape, unmolested, with its plunder. The trap, in the hands of the skilled Norse skogarmar, was a force multiplier of the most lethal, and the most economically efficient, kind, a device that required only the simple, locally available materials of the wood, the stone, and the soil, and the labor of a few hours with the spade and the axe, but which could, in an instant, disable or kill a heavily armored, expensively trained, and strategically irreplaceable Frankish knight and his warhorse, a classic, and timeless, example of the asymmetric, guerrilla logic that was the hidden, tactical genius of the Viking age. The Bjalka fall, the deadfall trap, was the more complex, more labor-intensive, and more spectacularly lethal of the Viking engineered ambush devices, a trap that used the massive, crushing weight of a suspended log or a rock, released by the cutting of a cord or the triggering of a trip wire, to annihilate, in a single, thunderous instant, a file of the advancing enemy soldiers. The saga of the Hervarar Saga Okerex, a legendary saga of the ancient, Gothic wars, contains a description of such a trap that is set by the hero, Hjalmar, in a narrow, rocky defile in the forest, a massive, ancient oak log suspended by the ropes from the overhanging branches, which is released, at the fatal moment, to crash down upon the pursuing Huns, crushing their skulls and their shields, and the bones of their horses, into a single, bloody, and indistinguishable mass. The saga, in its gory, visceral, and deeply satisfying account of the trap, is a literary, fictionalized memory of a real, practical, and widely employed technique of the guerrilla war, a technique that required a significant, and well-coordinated, investment of the time and the labor, the cutting, the shaping, and the suspending of the massive, heavy log, but which, when successfully executed, could, in a single, overwhelming, and utterly irreversible stroke, annihilate an entire, pursuing column of the enemy, a stroke that was the physical, violent equivalent of the false flight, a trap that turned the enemy's own, aggressive momentum into the very instrument of his annihilation. The palisade or the sudden, fortified barricade, was the third, and the most defensively oriented, of the Viking guerrilla traps, a trap that was used, not to kill the enemy directly, but to channel, to block, and to confuse his advance, to force him to expose his flanks, his rear, or his vulnerable, unshielded side to the sudden, concentrated assault of the hidden, waiting ambushes. Which was typically constructed from the felled trees, the sharpened stakes, and the interwoven branches, was a temporary, but highly effective, field fortification that could be erected by a skilled and well-coordinated team of the warriors, in a matter of the hours, a fortification that was designed to block a narrow, forest road, to force the pursuing Franks to dismount, to abandon their horses, and to attempt, under the constant, galling, and demoralizing fire of the hidden Norse archers and the javelin throwers, to dismantle or to circumvent the obstacle, a process that was, in itself, a slow, exhausting, and deeply hazardous ordeal, an ordeal that exposed the heavy, armored, and increasingly frustrated and terrified knights to the constant, unseen, and utterly lethal threat of the sudden, close-quarters ambush. In the hands of the Viking Skogarmar, was a tool of the area denial and the psychological warfare, a tool that transformed the forest from a passive, defenseless highway into an active, hostile, and deeply defended fortress, a fortress that could be held, by a small, determined, and highly mobile band of the guerrillas, against a vastly superior, but road-bound and psychologically vulnerable, enemy force. A force that was, by the slow, grinding, and utterly debilitating ordeal of the gradually, methodically, and irreversibly broken, its horses killed, its morale shattered, and its will to continue the pursuit utterly and completely destroyed. The legacy of the Viking traps, the engineered, mechanical devices of the hidden war, is a legacy that is largely invisible in the archaeological record, for the wood, the fiber, and the stakes have long since rotted into the acid soil of the European forests. But it is a legacy that is, nevertheless, deeply and permanently embedded in the tactical DNA of the Western military tradition. The principles of the obstacle, the channeling, and the pre-ranged killing ground that were employed, with such a devastating and such an economically efficient effect by the Norse Skogar men of the 9th century, are the same, fundamental, and unchanging principles that have been employed by the infantry, the sappers, and the special forces of every subsequent era of the warfare. From the English longbowmen at Agincourt to the Viet Cong in the jungles of the Siu Chi, the forest phantoms, the masters of the pitfall, the deadfall, and the were the remote, unacknowledged, and utterly forgotten ancestors of the modern military engineer, the silent, patient, and lethally effective technicians of the hidden war, whose legacy is the deep, unspoken, and permanent recognition that the land, in the hands of the skilled and the determined warrior, is the most powerful, the most versatile, and the most unforgiving of all the weapons. The hit-and-run raid, the Strandhog, was the basic, strategic unit of the Viking guerrilla war, a lightning-fast, amphibious operation that was designed to strike, with a maximum, concentrated violence, at a single, carefully reconnoitered, and economically high-value target, a monastery, a merchant settlement, a royal estate, and to extract, in a matter of the hours, the maximum portable wealth before the local, Frankish or Anglo-Saxon defenders could mobilize and respond. The Strandhog was not a battle. It was a raid, a heist, a carefully planned and ruthlessly executed extraction of the silver, the gold, the slaves, and the prestige goods that were the lifeblood of the Viking plunder economy, an economy that, as we have seen in the previous episodes, was meticulously audited by the Silfmar and the portable scale, and that was, in its strategic, operational logic, perfectly adapted to the hit-and-run, guerrilla mode of the warfare. The Norse chieftain, who had invested his capital in the Longship, the weapons, and the provisions for a crew of 40 or 50 warriors, could not afford to risk his fragile, valuable, and essentially irreplaceable human capital in a prolonged, attritional siege or a pitched, set-piece battle against a superior, heavily armored force. His return on the investment depended on the speed, the surprise, and the absolute, overwhelming violence of the initial assault, the rapid, efficient extraction of the plunder, and the immediate, undisrupted withdrawal to the ship and the sea. The Strandhog, in this economic and tactical calculus, was the perfect, rational instrument of the Viking enterprise, a raid that was, in its essence, a form of the strategic, amphibious guerrilla war, a war that was fought, not for the territory, but for the profit, and that was, for nearly 3 centuries, the most successful, the most feared, and the most destructive form of the economic predation that the Western world had ever seen. The intelligence-gathering phase of the Strandhog was the critical, and the most often overlooked, component of the operation, a phase that began, often weeks or months before the actual raid, with the careful, patient, and highly skilled reconnaissance of the target by the Norse scouts, the Njosnermen, the spies who operated, disguised as the traders, the merchants, the slaves, or the visiting pilgrims, in the ports, the markets, and the monastic guest houses of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Njosnermen, who were selected for their linguistic skills, their physical inconspicuousness, and their cool, calculating, and utterly fearless nature, would enter the target settlement, observe the layout of the streets, the gates, and the defensive fortifications, assess the strength and the alertness of the garrison, and note the location of the most valuable, the most portable, and the most easily extracted treasures. The gold and the silver reliquaries of the church, the strong box of the local comes, the slave pens of the merchants. The intelligence that these spies gathered, which was often transmitted by the prearranged signals of the smoke, the fire, or the sailing of a small, innocuous fishing boat, back to the waiting fleet in the hidden, coastal anchorage, was the essential, informational foundation of the raid, a foundation that allowed the Viking chieftain to plan the exact, precise timing, the route, and the tactical method of the assault, and that, in the vast majority of the cases, guaranteed the complete, devastating, and utterly one-sided success of the operation. The execution of the Strandhog itself was a model of the speed, the violence, and the iron, coordinated discipline, a sudden, shattering eruption of the howling, wolf-pelted warriors from the misty, dawn riverbank, or the pre-dawn, foggy sea, an eruption that was calculated to overwhelm the defenders, to paralyze their will, and to prevent any organized, effective resistance from forming. The first, crucial moments of the assault were directed, not at the defenders themselves, but at the physical, symbolic, and psychological infrastructure of the target. The gates, the doors, and the windows of the monastery or the town were smashed, simultaneously, by the heavy, iron-headed axes. The thatched roofs were set alight by the flaming, pitch-soaked arrows, and the screaming, the howling, and the rhythmic, terrifying clash of the axes on the shields. The skjaldarbit was designed to create a chaos, a confusion, and a paralyzing, supernatural terror that would, in a matter of the minutes, reduce the strongest, the most heavily fortified, and the most defiant of the Frankish or the Anglo-Saxon garrisons to a state of the helpless, uncoordinated, and utterly demoralized panic. The raiders, who had been assigned, before the assault, to the specific pre-reconnoiter tasks, the breaking of the treasury, the securing of the slaves, the holding of the escape route, moved with a fluid, coordinated, and wordless precision through the smoke and the screaming, a precision that was the product of the years of the shared, intimate experience of the Felig, the wolf pack, the human hunting machine that was the true tactical secret of the Viking military superiority. The plunder, the silver, the gold, the silks, and the human captives was seized, bundled, and carried, at a dead run, back to the waiting longships, which were beached, prows outward, on the riverbank or the shore, and which were, in a matter of the minutes, refloated, their oars manned, their sails raised, and their prows turned, with a final, contemptuous, and triumphant howl, towards the open, grey, and utterly inviolable safety of the sea. The withdrawal, the final, and the most dangerous, phase of the Strandhog, was executed with a speed, a discipline, and a ruthless, pragmatic disregard for the stragglers and the wounded that was the hallmark of the professional, guerrilla force, a force that understood, with a cold, unsentimental clarity, that the success of the mission, and the survival of the crew, depended on the immediate, undisrupted, and utterly uncompromising flight to the sea. The Norse chieftain, who had carefully calculated the tides, the currents, and the distance to the open water before the raid, would have positioned his longships at the exact, predetermined point of the embarkation, a point that was chosen for its proximity to the target, its defensibility against the sudden, local counter-attack, and its rapid, unobstructed access to the deep water channel that led to the sea. The raiders, their bodies laden with the heavy, clanking sacks of the silver and the gold, their arms dragging the terrified, bound captives, would pour, in a swift, disciplined stream, down the narrow, pre-reconnoitered lane to the riverbank, their rearguard, the elite staff bar, the stem warriors, holding off, with a cold, calculated, and utterly self-sacrificial ferocity, the first, disorganized, and desperate charges of the local, aroused defenders. The Longship, its oars already manned and its sail half raised, would push off from the shore at the exact, precise moment that the last of the rearguard, their axes bloody, their shields shattered, threw themselves, exhausted and wounded, into the shallow, icy water, their comrades hauling them, by the arms and the hair, over the low, open gunwale, a final, brutal, and deeply moving act of the Felig loyalty that was the moral and the tactical core of the wolf pack. The Strandhog, from the first, sudden, shattering assault to the final, silent, mist-shrouded disappearance of the Longship into the grey, endless sea, was a complete, closed, and perfectly self-contained cycle of the guerrilla violence, a cycle that was the fundamental, strategic heartbeat of the Viking Age, a cycle that was, for 3 centuries, the terror, the mystery, and the utterly unassailable power of the North. The winter camps, the Vtr-setter and the Var-setter, that the Viking Great Army and other large, semi-permanent raiding forces established on the rivers and the coasts of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, were a strategic innovation of the most profound, and the most destructive, significance, an innovation that transformed the hit-and-run, seasonal raid into a sustained, multi-year, and territorially devastating campaign of the guerrilla occupation. The Vtr-setter, which was first employed on a large, systematic scale by the Great Army during its campaign in England in the 860s and 870s, was a fortified, winter encampment that was established on a defensible island, a river bend, or a coastal marsh, a camp that was designed to be a permanent, secure, and economically self-sustaining base of operations. A base from which the Viking army could continue to raid, to forage, and to terrorize the surrounding countryside throughout the long, dark, and traditionally campaign-less months of the winter. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its entries for the years 871-878 c, records the movements of the Great Army as a series of the annual, strategic relocations, from the Vitrsätra at Reading to the Vitrsätra at London, from London to Torksey, and from Torksey to Repton, a slow, methodical, and utterly devastating progression of the fortified, mobile bases that moved, year by year, across the face of the English kingdoms, a progression that was, in its strategic essence, a form of the large-scale, conventionalized guerrilla war, a war that used the temporary, fortified camps as the secure, territorial anchors from which the mobile, raiding columns could extend the terror, the extraction, and the political destabilization across an ever-widening area of the countryside. The tactical and the logistical advantages of the Vitrsätra were, from the Viking perspective, immense and transformative. The camp, which was typically surrounded by a massive, earthen rampart, a deep, water-filled ditch, and a palisade of the sharpened, interwoven stakes, was a virtually impregnable stronghold, a stronghold that could be defended by a relatively small, skeleton garrison, against the largest and the most determined of the Anglo-Saxon or the Frankish assaults, a stronghold that provided a secure, sheltered, and warm refuge for the warriors, the women, the children, and the massive, accumulated plunder of the previous year's raiding. The Vitrsätra was not merely a defensive fortress but an offensive, logistical hub, a place where the longships could be repaired and refitted, where the captured silver could be weighed, assayed, and divided among the felagar by the silvermar and the portable scale, where the slaves could be penned, fed, and prepared for the spring, international market, and where the fresh, young horses, seized from the terrified English and Frankish farmers, could be broken, trained, and prepared for the mounted, summer raiding of the cavalry Viking, the new, hybrid, and immensely fast and mobile form of the guerrilla war that the Great Army had pioneered. The camp was, in effect, a permanent, mobile, and virtually self-sufficient Viking city-state, a city-state that was transplanted, at the will of the chieftains, into the very heart of the enemy territory, a city-state that was the physical, territorial, and psychological anchor of the guerrilla occupation, a base that extended the seasonal, hit-and-run raid into a permanent, grinding, and economically parasitic war of the attrition. The guerrilla, hit-and-run raids that were launched from the Vitrsätra during the winter months were a form of the warfare that was, from the perspective of the Anglo-Saxon and the Frankish defenders, the most terrifying, the most demoralizing, and the most economically devastating of all, for the traditional, early medieval campaigning season, which was dictated by the agricultural cycle of the planting and the harvest, was, effectively, abolished. The English FYRD, the local, defensive levy of the free farmers, could only be mobilized, by the law and the custom, for a limited period of the weeks, and the men of the FYRD, who were the primary, and the only, military force that could be deployed against the mobile Viking raiding columns, had to be released, at the onset of the autumn, to return to their farms, to harvest the grain, and to prepare for the winter, a period of the enforced, military inactivity that the Vikings, in their warm, secure, and well-provisioned Vitrsätra, exploited with a cold, calculated, and utterly merciless efficiency. The winter raids, the sudden, silent, and murderous descents of the mounted, wolf-pelted warriors on the snow-bound, isolated villages and monasteries, were a form of the psychological and the economic terror that was specifically designed to shatter the already fragile Anglo-Saxon morale, to destroy the agricultural base of the kingdom, and to extract, from the exhausted, starving, and freezing population, the last, desperate, and utterly insufficient Danegeld payments that the king, in his helpless, humiliated impotence, was forced to raise. The Brissarthe was the strategic weapon that transformed the hit-and-run raid from a seasonal, opportunistic nuisance into a permanent, structural, and ultimately existential catastrophe for the Anglo-Saxon state, a catastrophe that was, in the final, desperate years of the 9th century, only averted by the equally radical, and equally innovative, defensive measures of King Alfred of Wessex. A king who, as we have previously discussed, understood, with a clarity that was unmatched among his contemporaries, that the only way to defeat the guerrilla was to adopt the guerrilla's own methods, to build the fortified, permanent bases, the buzz, and to wage a counter-insurgency war of the attrition, the patience, and the unshakable, institutional, and economic resistance. The archaeology of the Brissarthe, particularly the recent, extensive excavations of the Great Army's camp at Torksey in Lincolnshire and the camp at Foremark in Derbyshire, has provided a stunning, material, and often deeply intimate window into the daily, economic, and military life of the Viking guerrilla occupation, a window that confirms and extends the sparse and often hostile written accounts of the chronicles. The thousands of the metal detector finds from Torksey, the silver ingots, the hacked, clipped dirhams, the fragments of the portable scales, the broken, discarded weapons, the lead, spindle whorls for the weaving of the wool, the iron, slave shackles, and the tiny, exquisite, personal items of the female jewelry, paint a picture of a vast, sprawling, and industrially active camp, a camp that was, simultaneously, a military fortress, a financial, auditing center, a slave market, and a domestic family settlement, a settlement that was inhabited, for the long dark winter months, by the thousands of the men, the women, and the children who were the permanent, human infrastructure of the Viking war machine. The camp at Torksey, which was, in its time, the largest, the most powerful, and the most feared settlement in all of the eastern England, was the physical, territorial manifestation of the guerrilla occupation, a hidden, fortified city in the heart of the Danelaw, a city that was built, maintained, and supplied by the systematic, ruthless, and utterly efficient exploitation of the surrounding conquered English countryside, a city that was the ultimate, strategic weapon of the forest phantoms. The weapon that transformed the hit-and-run raid into a permanent, and almost irreversible, territorial conquest. The psychological dimension of the Viking guerrilla war, the terror of the unseen, the unexpected, and the utterly merciless attack from the dark, silent forest, the misty, shrouded swamp, or the pre-dawn, foggy river, was a weapon that was as carefully, as deliberately, and as effectively wielded as the axe and the spear, a weapon that was, in its long-term, corrosive effect on the morale and the will of the defending populations, perhaps the most devastating of all the Norse armaments. The Christian, monastic chroniclers who are the primary, and often the only, written sources for the Viking Age were, by their education, their worldview, and their literary conventions, predisposed to interpret the raids of the Northmen as a divine, eschatological punishment, a sign of the wrath of God upon a sinful and apostate people, a narrative that, in a sense, conceded the psychological, and even the theological, victory to the heathens, for it framed the Vikings' success not as a product of the human, tactical skill but as an inevitable, irresistible, and divinely ordained force of the nature, a force that could only be opposed by the prayer, the penance, and the moral, communal reformation. The Vikings, who were, in their own, pagan understanding, the servants of Odin, the god of the ecstasy and the terror, actively and deliberately cultivated this aura of the supernatural, demonic power, an aura that was physically, visually, and audibly manifested in the wolf pelts, the filed, sharpened teeth, the howling, shield-biting berserksgang, and the sudden, silent, and utterly unexplainable appearance and disappearance of the raiding parties, a mastery of the psychological, information warfare that was, in its own way, as advanced, as sophisticated, and as ruthlessly effective as any of the tactical, ambush techniques. The specific, psychological weapon of the silence, the GN, was a hallmark of the Viking forest ambush, a silence that was not the mere, passive absence of the noise but an active, oppressive, and deeply unnerving presence, a presence that signaled the complete, predatory control of the terrain, a control that was so absolute that the forest, the swamp, and the riverbank, which were, to the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons. The places of the danger, the chaos, and the supernatural, demonic terror, had been, in the hands of the Norse, rendered utterly silent, utterly still, and utterly, lethally concentrated. The Frankish knight, advancing, with his clanking, jingling armor and his snorting, stomping warhorse, along the narrow, sunken, and heavily canopied forest lane, would be surrounded, suddenly, by a silence so complete, so profound, and so unnatural that it would, in a matter of the moments, shatter his nerve, a silence in which the only sounds were the pounding of his own terrified heart and the slow, deliberate, and unidentifiable rustle of the leaves that signaled the patient, invisible, and utterly lethal presence of the wolf pack, a presence that could, at any instant, erupt, without the warning, into a storm of the screaming, the iron, and the blood. The Norse Skogarmar, by his mastery of the silence, had weaponized the forest's very stillness, a stillness that was the audible, terrifying signature of the hidden predator, a signature that was, to the Christian, civilized, and road-bound mind, the most potent, the most disorienting, and the most psychologically shattering of all the Viking weapons. The psychological impact of the hit and run, the constant, unpredictable, and utterly unanswerable nature of the Viking guerrilla war was, over the long, grinding decades of the 9th century, a slow, corrosive acid that ate away at the social, the economic, and the political fabric of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, an acid that was as destructive, in its own, invisible way, as the fire and the sword of the raid itself. The inability of the central, royal authority to protect the isolated, rural monasteries and the villages, the constant, gnawing fear of the sudden, dawn attack, the repeated, and always futile, local mobilizations of the FYRD to chase the phantom, vanishing raiders, and the annual, humiliating, and economically devastating payments of the Danegeld, all these factors combined to produce a deep, widespread, and ultimately fatal crisis of the political legitimacy, a crisis in which the local, regional lords, the Comites and the Missi, who could, by their own private fortifications and their own hired, mounted retinues, offer a more immediate, more effective, and more tangible protection to the terrified peasantry, gradually, and inexorably, displaced the distant, impotent, and discredited Carolingian state as the primary, and the only, focus of the political loyalty and the social organization. The feudal, decentralized, and castle-based political order that emerged from the wreckage of the Carolingian Empire in the 10th and the 11th centuries was, in this profound, structural sense, the direct, and the unintended, political consequence of the Viking guerrilla war, a war that the Frankish kings, with their heavy, cavalry-based, and road-bound military system, could not fight, could not understand, and could not survive. The forest phantoms, by their silent, patient, and utterly relentless hidden war, had not merely sacked the monasteries and the towns of the empire, they had, in a very real and a very permanent sense, dismantled the political order of the entire, early medieval West, a victory that was, in its long-term, historical consequence, the most complete, the most enduring, and the most invisible of all the victories of the Viking Age. The legacy of the psychological terror that the forest phantoms unleashed on the Christian West is a legacy that is deeply, and permanently, embedded in the folklore, the art, and the collective, subconscious memory of the European peoples, a memory that surfaces, in the dark, nocturnal tales of the werewolf, the wild huntsman, and the demon of the forest, a memory that is, in its essence, the traumatized, pathologized, and endlessly repeated echo of the sudden, silent, and utterly inexplicable terror of the Viking ambush. The medieval, European fear of the forest, the Silva Horrida, the dark, untamed, and deeply threatening wilderness that was the dwelling place of the outlaws, the monsters, and the heathens, was a fear that was, in large part, the direct, historical legacy of the Viking Age, a legacy that was carved by the axe and the javelin into the psyche of the continent, a legacy that transformed the ancient European woodland from a bountiful, familiar, and divinely ordered realm of the nature into a place of the permanent, hidden, and unspeakable dread, a place where the trees, the shadows, and the silence itself were the accomplices of the wolf, the heathen, and the ghost. The forest phantoms, the silent, patient, and utterly lethal masters of the hidden war, had, by their centuries of the patient, relentless, and psychologically devastating campaign, succeeded in conquering not merely the territory of the European kingdoms but the very imagination of the European peoples, a conquest that is, even now, 1,000 years after the last longship rotted on the last, forgotten fjord, a permanent, invisible, and utterly unassailable domain of the north. The ambush at the River Lea in the autumn of 894 C, a brilliantly executed and nearly fatal trap that caught the formidable West Saxon army of King Alfred the Great during the twilight years of his reign, stands as a testament to the enduring tactical genius of the Viking guerrilla warrior even in the face of the most sophisticated counterinsurgency defenses that the early medieval world had ever devised. Alfred, who had, over the previous 2 decades, revolutionized the military infrastructure of Wessex with his network of fortified baths, his standing, mobile field army, and his newly constructed, purpose-built naval fleet, had by the early 890s, effectively neutralized the strategic, territorial threat of the large, Danish armies that had conquered Northumbria and East Anglia. However, the war in the shadows, the hit-and-run, riverine guerrilla campaign conducted by the smaller, more mobile, and more tactically flexible Viking bands that continued to operate from the semi-independent, fortified bases of the Danelaw, was a threat that even the great Alfred could not entirely eliminate, and the disaster on the Lea was a brutal, and humbling, reminder of the limits of the conventional territorial defense against the determined, and ecologically intelligent guerrilla enemy. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its entry for the year 894, records that a large force of Danish Vikings, having sailed their longships up the River Lea, a navigable, tidal tributary of the Thames that flows through the heavily wooded, marshy country of Hertfordshire and Essex, constructed a formidable, earthen fortification, a juwork, on the banks of the river. A fort that was situated at a carefully chosen, narrow, and heavily forested bend in the waterway, a position that controlled the riverine approach to the heart of the West Saxon kingdom, and that provided an ideal, concealed base for the launching of the hit-and-run raids into the surrounding, prosperous countryside. Alfred, responding to the threat with his characteristic, strategic speed, marched his field army to the banks of the Lea, constructed a system of his own, counter-fortifications, and attempted to blockade the Danish garrison, a siege that was intended to starve the raiders into submission and to trap their invaluable fleet of the longships far from the safety of the open sea, a classic, and previously successful, application of the Alfredian, counterinsurgency doctrine. The Danish chieftain who commanded the garrison on the Lea, a man whose name is unfortunately lost to the record but whose tactical cunning is etched permanently into the terse, frustrated prose of the West Saxon chronicler, responded to Alfred's siege with a masterclass of the strategic, guerrilla misdirection and the sudden, devastating ambush. The Danes, feigning a desperate, last-ditch breakout attempt, abandoned their fort, under the cover of the darkness, leaving their heavy, lumbering longships behind, and they withdrew, not towards the open sea, but deeper into the dense, pathless, and heavily forested interior of the Essex countryside, a withdrawal that was, in its essence, a false flight, a lure that was designed to draw the pursuing, and now confident, West Saxon army into a terrain that the Danes had previously reconnoitered, and that they knew, with an intimate, topographical precision, was a death trap for the heavily armed, but road-bound, English infantry. The Chronicle, with the bitter, retrospective wisdom of the survivor, records that Alfred's men, upon discovering the abandoned Danish fort and the empty, beached longships, did exactly what the Danes had anticipated. They divided their forces, sending a strong detachment of the cavalry and the infantry in a headlong, poorly coordinated pursuit of the fleeing heathens, a pursuit that was, from its very inception, a fatal, and a predictably fatal, error. The Danes, who had, during their months of the occupation of the Lea fort, thoroughly scouted and mapped the entire, complex network of the forest trails, the hidden, boggy defile, and the deep, fast-flowing streams of the region, led the West Saxon pursuers into a narrow, heavily wooded valley, a valley that was dominated, on both sides, by the steep, densely forested ridges, a valley that was, in effect, a pre-selected and pre-ranged killing ground. The ambush, when it was sprung, was a sudden, simultaneous, and utterly annihilating eruption of the javelins, the arrows, and the howling, wolf-pelted warriors from the densely forested slopes, an eruption that shattered the strung-out, exhausted, and utterly disorganized West Saxon column, that killed or captured a significant portion of the elite, household troops of the king, and that allowed the Danish raiders, their mission now accomplished, to melt, once again, into the deep, dark, and utterly inviolable silence of the English forest, their longships, which they would later recover or rebuild, a secondary, and easily replaceable, loss. The Battle of the River Lea, as it is known to the historians, was not a battle in the conventional, set-piece sense. It was a pure, classic, and almost perfectly executed guerrilla ambush, an ambush that was designed to achieve not a territorial conquest but a specific, limited, and immensely damaging strategic objective: the humiliation and the bleeding of the West Saxon field army, the destruction of its elite, mobile strike force, and the demonstration, to the population of the Danelaw and to the watching, political world of the North, that even the great, the invincible, the God-protected King Alfred of Wessex could be outwitted, outflanked, and decisively defeated in the dark, silent depths of the forest. The immediate, tactical consequence of the ambush was the effective, temporary neutralization of the West Saxon army's capacity to conduct the offensive, counter-insurgency operations in the borderlands of the Danelaw, a neutralization that allowed the Danish raiders, who were now reinforced by the fresh, opportunistic bands from the eastern settlements, to expand their hit-and-run campaign across the entire, vulnerable frontier of the Wessex, a campaign that would, for the next several years, tie down the West Saxon forces and exhaust the kingdom's fragile, agrarian economy. Alfred, who was, by this point in his life, an old man, physically exhausted, and increasingly afflicted by the mysterious, chronic illness that would eventually kill him, was forced, by the disaster on the Lea, to recognize the fundamental, and ultimately insoluble, dilemma of the guerrilla war: the most sophisticated, the most expensive, and the most meticulously maintained defensive system in the world could be circumvented, and could be fatally damaged, by a small, determined, and ecologically intelligent enemy who understood, with a predator's instinct, the hidden, exploitable weaknesses of the terrain, the weather, and the human, psychological frailty of the defenders. The forest phantoms, by their victory on the Lea, had demonstrated, for the final, and the most humiliating, time, that the hidden war, the shadow war, was a war that could not be won by the fortifications, the navies, or the armies alone, a war that would only end when the last guerrilla band had been assimilated, annihilated, or bought off, a process that would take, not the years, but the generations, and that would, in the end, transform the very nature of the English kingdom and the English people. The long-term, strategic significance of the River Lea ambush lies not in its immediate, tactical outcome, which was, after all, eventually reversed by the patient, persistent, and institutionally resilient defensive system that Alfred had built, but in its status as the final, great, and historically symbolic victory of the old, pagan, and purely guerrilla mode of the Viking warfare over the new, Christian, and state-based military order that Alfred had pioneered. The ambush on the Lea was, in a sense, the last, defiant howl of the wolf pack, a demonstration that the ancient, sacred, and ecologically rooted art of the hidden war, the art that had been forged in the dark, primeval forests of the Scandinavian homeland and that had terrorized the coasts and the rivers of Europe for 2 centuries, could still, even in the face of the most formidable, and the most modern, of the conventional defenses, achieve a victory that was as sudden, as devastating, and as utterly demoralizing as any that the first, legendary raiders of the 8th century had ever achieved. The forest phantoms, who had, by the 890s, been driven from the open, coastal plains and the great, navigable rivers of the continent by the rise of the fortified, centralized state, had retreated, for their final, defiant stand, into the dark, ancient, and deeply symbolic terrain of the English forest, the forest that had, for centuries, been the sacred, liminal space of the pagan, the outlaw, and the wolf, and they had, in that dark, silent, and utterly unforgiving terrain, demonstrated, for one last, glorious, and tragic time, the lethal, and the enduring power of the land as a weapon. The sophisticated network of scouts, spies, and local informants that the Viking warbands employed was the invisible, and the utterly essential, nervous system of the guerrilla war, a system that allowed the raiders to operate, for months or even years, in the hostile, heavily defended, and geographically complex terrains of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with an information advantage that was, in its own way, as decisive as the speed of the longship or the lethality of the axe. The Njsnarmer, the scout spy, was a specialized, highly trained, and deeply trusted member of the Felig, a man who combined the linguistic fluency of the seasoned trader, the cultural adaptability of the diplomat, and the physical, observational, and memory skills of the hunter and the tracker, a man who could, on his own, and at a moment's notice, disappear into the anonymous, transient population of a Frankish market town or an Anglo-Saxon monastic guest house, and who could, over the course of the weeks or the months, gather the specific, actionable intelligence, the location of the silver treasury, the strength and the disposition of the local garrison, the timing of the local, weekly market, the secret, hidden path through the dangerous, surrounding swamp. That was the essential precondition of the successful, profitable, and survivable hit and run raid. The Norse sagas, though they are often focused on the heroic, individual deeds of the great warriors, are, in fact, rich with the casual, almost incidental, references to the vital, and the often unsung, role of the scout, the spajari, who is sent ahead, in disguise to learn the land and the ways of the people. A role that is, in the context of the guerrilla war, the most dangerous, the most intellectually demanding, and the most strategically important of all the warrior's tasks. The intelligence that the Njsnarmer gathered was not merely the tactical, short-term information of the immediate, upcoming raid but also the strategic, long-term intelligence of the political, economic, and military vulnerabilities of the enemy kingdom, intelligence that was patiently, systematically, and cumulatively compiled, over the years and the decades, by the generations of the scouts who operated, often in the deep, long-term cover, in the ports, the markets, and the royal courts of the continent. The great, strategic decisions of the Viking Age, the shift of the main raiding effort from the Frankish coast to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the mid-9th century, the selection of the Seine and the Loire as the primary, arterial highways for the penetration of the Carolingian heartland, the timing of the Great Army's invasion of Northumbria in 866 CE, which coincided with the exact, precise moment of the kingdom's fatal, internal, civil war, were not the products of the random, opportunistic luck or the divinely inspired, Odinic frenzy but the calculated, rational, and deeply informed decisions of the chieftains who had, at their disposal, a continuous, reliable, and remarkably sophisticated stream of the strategic, political, and military intelligence, a stream that was the product of the silent, invisible, and utterly essential work of the Njsnarmer. The anonymous, and the utterly forgotten, Norse scout who walked, disguised as a Frisian merchant, through the dusty, crowded streets of the Frankish royal capital of Compiègne, who noted the departure of the main, imperial army for the distant, Pyrenean border, and who then, with a quiet, unassuming nod to the guard at the gate, walked, unhurriedly, down to the river bank, and rowed his small, inconspicuous boat down the Oise to the waiting, hidden fleet, was, in a very real and a very historically significant sense, the man who conquered the Carolingian Empire, the invisible, essential, and utterly silent architect of the Viking victory. The methods of the Njsnarmer were the methods of the classic, timeless spy, the disguise, the cover story, the patient, unobtrusive observation, the cultivation of the local, disaffected, or bribable informants, and the ability to read, and to interpret the subtle, non-verbal signs of the wealth, the power, and the vulnerability that were the essential, diagnostic indicators of a profitable and a survivable target. The Norse scout, who was often a man of the mixed, Norse Celtic or Norse Frankish ancestry, a man who could pass, in the dress, the speech, and the mannerisms, for a local, native trader or a pilgrim, would enter the target town or the monastery, his eyes and his ears open, his demeanor friendly, open, and utterly unthreatening, and he would, over the course of the days or the weeks, map, in his mind. The layout of the streets, the gates, and the defensive walls count the number of the armed. Garrison men and assess their state of the alertness and the training, locate the exact, precise positions of the treasury, the stable, and the slave pens, and most importantly, identify the hidden, unguarded, and exploitable weakness, the crumbling, unrepaired section of the wall, the small, neglected, postern gate that led to the dark, silent alley, the local, disloyal, or disaffected servant who could be bribed or blackmailed to unlock the door or to draw the bar at the appointed, fatal hour. The scout, upon his return to the hidden, forest anchorage or the secret, coastal cove, would then, with the aid of the drawings in the sand or the carved, wooden models, brief the chieftain and the felagar on every, specific, and minute detail of the target, a briefing that was the essential, informational foundation of the meticulously planned, and the perfectly executed, hit-and-run raid. A briefing that transformed the chaotic, unpredictable risk of the attack into a calculated, and ruthlessly efficient, extraction of the wealth. The counterintelligence measures that the Viking chieftains employed to protect their own, operational security, the secrecy of the hidden, forest camps and the timing and the route of the raids, were, in their own way, as sophisticated and as effective as the intelligence-gathering methods of the Njsnarmer. The Norse camp, whether it was the temporary, summer base on a hidden, riverine island or the semi-permanent, winter VTR set in the heart of the Danelaw, was a closed, tightly controlled, and obsessively guarded community, a community that was surrounded by a cordon of the silent, hidden, and utterly lethal sentinels, the VRR, the Watchers, who were positioned, for days and nights at a time, in the dense camouflage cover of the forest edge or the reed bed, their eyes and their ears attuned, with a preternatural, hunter's sensitivity, to the slightest unnatural sound or the movement, a cordon that was, to the local, Frankish or Anglo-Saxon peasant who might, accidentally or deliberately, stumble into its vicinity, a silent, invisible, and instantly fatal boundary. The Norse chieftains, who understood, with a cold, pragmatic clarity, the devastating, operational consequences of a betrayal by a local, informant or a captured, careless scout, enforced a regime of the absolute, and the often brutal, secrecy, a regime in which the unauthorized, wandering civilian who was found in the vicinity of the camp was killed, on the spot, without the question or the mercy. A regime in which the captured, enemy scout was subjected to the prolonged, and the horrific torture to extract the information before being executed, his body left, in a prominent, visible position, as a grim, silent, and utterly unambiguous warning to the local population of the fatal, and the irreversible, cost of the collaboration with the Frankish or the Anglo-Saxon authorities. The forest phantoms, by their mastery of the intelligence and the counterintelligence, had, in effect, created an invisible, informational wall around their operations, a wall that was as impenetrable, as effective, and as utterly lethal as any fortress of the stone and the iron, a wall that was, in the final, strategic analysis, the secret, hidden foundation of the Viking guerrilla war. The role of the mounted Viking warrior, the Ridari or the cavalry Viking, in the guerrilla campaigns of the late 9th and the 10th centuries represents a remarkable, and a largely unappreciated, tactical evolution, an evolution that fused the ancient, Scandinavian skills of the forest ambush and the hit-and-run raid with the newly acquired, continental technology of the warhorse, the stirrup, and the mounted shock combat, a fusion that created a hybrid, an immensely fast and mobile form of the guerrilla war that was capable of striking, at a moment's notice, deep into the interior of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, far from the navigable, riverine highways that had been the traditional, and the essential, arteries of the Viking incursions. The Great Army, during its campaign in England in the 860s and 870s, had, out of the sheer, practical necessity, learned to master the art of the mounted, infantry warfare, a mode of the operation in which the Viking warriors, who were, traditionally, the foot-bound, sea-borne raiders, would capture, break, and train the local, English and Frankish horses, and would then use these horses to transport their forces, at a speed that was previously unimaginable, across the vast, road-bound, and heavily defended territories of the hostile kingdoms, dismounting, at the moment of the attack, to fight, in their traditional, foot-bound, and shield wall mode, a tactic that was, in its essence, a strategic, and a tactical, revolution, a revolution that transformed the Viking army from a slow, riverine-bound, and seasonally predictable raiding force into a fast, land-based, and utterly unpredictable mobile strike force, a force that could, and did, dictate the tempo, the location, and the strategic initiative of the entire, prolonged, and grindingly attritional war of the conquest. The mounted, guerrilla raiding that the Vikings conducted from their winter camps in the Danelaw was a form of the warfare that was, in its tactical essence, a high-speed, long-range, and deeply penetrating version of the traditional, foot-bound, forest ambush, a version that was capable of striking, without the warning, at the soft, undefended underbelly of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the isolated, rural monasteries, the rich, agricultural estates, and the unfortified, market towns that were far from the protective walls of Alfred's Buzz and beyond the reach of the slow, infantry-bound, and seasonally constrained primeval. The Viking raiding party, which was now composed of a small, hand-picked, and highly disciplined band of perhaps 20 or 30 warriors, each mounted on a fast, sturdy, and well-trained English horse, and each leading a spare, pack horse that was laden with the provisions, the water, and the essential, portable, and rapidly deployable equipment of the ambush, would leave the VTR set under the cover of the darkness or the dense, autumn fog, and would, by a network of the hidden, reconnoitered forest trails and the secret, shallow fords that were unknown to the local, English population, ride, for the hours or even the days, deep into the heart of the enemy territory, a silent, ghostly, and utterly undetectable column of the shadows that was, to the unsuspecting, sleeping villages and the isolated, vulnerable monasteries, a sudden, violent, and utterly inexplicable eruption of the death and the fire from the dark, silent, and previously safe, surrounding countryside. The mounted Viking, the cavalry Viking, was the ultimate, evolutionary expression of the forest phantom, a phantom that had now acquired the speed, the range, and the strategic mobility of the horse, a phantom that could, in a single, terrifying night, strike, loot, and vanish, leaving behind, in the cold, grey dawn, only the smoking, bloody ruins and the terrified, traumatized survivors, a phantom that was, to the chroniclers of the Anglo-Saxon and the Frankish kingdoms, the final and the most terrifying confirmation of the demonic, supernatural, and utterly unassailable power of the heathen North. The tactical countermeasures that the Anglo-Saxon and the Frankish defenders developed to combat the mounted, Viking guerrilla were, in their own way, as innovative and as transformative as the threat they were designed to counter, a series of the defensive adaptations that included the construction of the fortified, garrison bridges, the BRYCG Juyork, that blocked the strategic, river crossings, the systematic, and the often brutal, clearance of the dense, forested cover along the major military roads, and most importantly, the creation of the rapid response, mounted strike forces, the Equites and the Thanes, that were capable of matching the speed and the mobility of the Viking raiders and of intercepting them, in the open field or the narrow, constricted valley, before they could reach the safety of their hidden, forest lairs. The mounted, counterinsurgency warfare of the late Anglo-Saxon period, which was pioneered by Alfred's son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson, Athelstan, was a direct, and a highly successful, response to the mounted, Viking guerrilla threat, a response that, over the course of the 10th century, gradually, and systematically, pushed the Viking raiders out of the interior of the English kingdom and confined them, once again, to the coastal, riverine periphery, a response that was, in its strategic and its tactical essence, a mirror image of the Viking guerrilla war, a war that was now, in the hands of the English kings, being waged, with a superior, institutional, and economic power, against the very men who had invented it. The forest phantoms, the mounted, silent, and utterly lethal raiders of the dark, English knights, had, by their own, brilliant, adaptive innovation, sown the seeds of their own, eventual, and inevitable destruction, a destruction that was, in the final, historical analysis, the ultimate, and the most ironic, of the many, complex legacies of the Viking guerrilla war. The riverine ambush, the sudden, devastating attack that was launched from the cover of the dense, overhanging vegetation of the riverbank, or the sudden, narrow, cliff-bound defile upon the slow, heavily laden, and utterly vulnerable transport vessels of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, was a specialized, and a lethally effective, variant of the Viking guerrilla war. A variant that exploited the fundamental, and the ultimately fatal, dependence of the continental economies on the open, unprotected, and easily obstructed inland waterways. The great rivers of Europe, the Rhine, the Meuse, the Seine, the Loire, the Thames, and the Shannon, were, in the 9th and the 10th centuries, the liquid highways of the commerce, the communication, and the military logistics, the arteries through which the silver, the grain, the wine, the iron, and the armies flowed, slowly and predictably, from the interior, productive heartlands to the coastal, trading emporiums and the royal administrative centers. The Viking chieftains, who were, above all else, the masters of the river, the men who had learned, from their earliest childhood in the fjords and the mountain streams of Scandinavia, the art of reading the current, the tide, and the hidden, underwater obstacle, understood, with a clarity that was unmatched among their enemies, that the river was not merely a highway for the raid but a trap, a natural, and an infinitely exploitable, killing ground that was perfectly, and lethally, suited to the ambush. The Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon transport barges, the slow, heavy, flat-bottomed naves that carried the annual, tax grain of a royal estate or the precious, silver altar plate of a relocated monastery, were, in the hands of a skilled, patient, and well-positioned Viking river ambusher, the sitting ducks of the medieval warfare, the unarmed, unarmored, and utterly defenseless vessels that could be, in a matter of the minutes, boarded, plundered, and sunk, their crews, the terrified, unarmed sailors and the local, peasant levies, slaughtered or drowned, their precious, essential, and utterly irreplaceable cargoes seized and transferred, with a practiced, efficient, and utterly ruthless speed, to the waiting, hidden longships of the raiders. The specific, tactical requirements of the riverine ambush, the selection of the perfect, fatal choke point and the precise, coordinated timing of the multi-directional attack, demanded a level of the topographic, hydrological, and the military planning that was the hallmark of the Viking guerrilla operations. The ideal, river ambush site was a place where the navigable channel was constricted by the steep, rocky cliffs or the dense, overhanging forest, into a narrow, single-file defile, a place where the river's current was fast, turbulent, and deeply unpredictable, a place where the transport barges, which were often hauled by the gangs of the exhausted, half-naked slaves or the draft animals, against the powerful downstream current, were forced to slow to a virtual, creeping crawl, a place where the barge's crews, their attention entirely absorbed by the desperate, physical struggle to navigate the dangerous, boiling water, were utterly oblivious to the silent, patient, and lethally prepared wolf pack that was concealed, in the dense, camouflaged cover of the forested bank, a mere stone's throw from the vulnerable, laboring vessels. The ambush, when it was sprung, was a sudden, simultaneous, and utterly overwhelming assault from both banks, a storm of the javelins, the arrows, and the grappling hooks that was directed, with a cold, surgical precision, at the steersmen and the helmsmen of the lead barge, the men whose sudden, violent death would, in an instant, transform the entire, slow-moving convoy into a chaos of the tangled, drifting, and utterly unsteerable vessels, a floating, disorganized, and defenseless mass of the wood and the cargo that was then, at the leisure of the wolf pack, boarded, one by one, and systematically, methodically, and utterly ruthlessly stripped of its plunder, its prisoners, and its provisions. The psychological, and the economic, impact of the riverine ambush on the interior, river-dependent economies of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was a slow, corrosive, and ultimately devastating consequence of the Viking guerrilla war, a consequence that was, in many respects, even more significant than the immediate, physical loss of the plunder. The constant, unpredictable, and utterly uninsurable threat of the river ambush effectively, and permanently, disrupted the ancient, vital, and deeply integrated network of the riverine trade and the royal, tax grain transportation, a disruption that forced the monasteries, the towns, and the royal estates to abandon the vulnerable, liquid highways and to rely, instead, on the slow, expensive, and logistically inadequate overland road transport, a shift that increased the cost, the time, and the risk of the famine and the economic collapse. The silver pennies of the Carolingian mints, which had, for centuries, circulated, freely and rapidly, along the great, liquid arteries of the empire, became scarce, hoarded, and progressively debased, a monetary crisis that was, in large part, the direct, and the intended, consequence of the Vikings' systematic, strategic strangulation of the riverine, economic lifelines of the continent. The forest phantoms, by their mastery of the river ambush, had not merely stolen the silver and the grain of the Frankish state. They had, in a very real and a very permanent sense, severed the liquid arteries of the early medieval economy, a severance that was, in its long-term, structural, and ultimately fatal consequence, one of the most decisive, and the most invisible, victories of the entire Viking Age. The Viking campaigns in the Iberian Peninsula and the western Mediterranean during the mid-9th century, a series of the audacious, long-range, and deeply penetrating raids that took the Norse fleets far from their familiar, northern waters and into the heart of the sophisticated, heavily fortified, and deeply alien Islamic and Christian cultures of the south, were, in their tactical and their strategic essence, a sustained, amphibious guerrilla war, a war that was fought, not in the dense pine forests of the north, but in the sun-baked, rocky gorges, the arid, scrub-covered hills, and the narrow, treacherous coastal inlets of the Spanish and the Moroccan coasts. The great Viking expedition that sailed from the Loire in 844 CE, under the command of the chieftains who are recorded in the Latin chronicles as Ragnar and Bjorn Ironside, struck, with a sudden, overwhelming, and utterly unexpected violence, at the rich, Muslim cities of the Atlantic coast of the Iberian Peninsula, the sack of Gijón, the terrifying, brutal assault on the great Umayyad port of Lisbon, the audacious, and almost successful, attack on the wealthy, Andalusian city of Seville, and then, in the following year, the fleet sailed through the Straits of Gibraltar, into the Mediterranean, the first, recorded Viking incursion into that ancient, civilized, and utterly unprepared sea, a raid that would, for the next 2 decades, terrorize the coasts of the Moorish Spain, the Balearic Islands, the Frankish Septimania, and the Italian peninsula, a raid that was, in its extraordinary range, its strategic audacity, and its tactical, adaptive genius, one of the most remarkable, and the most overlooked, campaigns of the entire Viking Age. The specific, guerrilla tactics that the Norse employed in the Mediterranean theater were, of necessity, a radical, adaptive departure from the forest and the swamp ambushes of the northern campaigns, a departure that was dictated by the fundamentally different terrain, the climate, and the military technology of the Islamic and the Christian south. The dense, old-growth forests of the north, which had provided the essential concealment and the tactical depth for the Viking hit-and-run raids, were largely absent from the arid, scrub-covered, and heavily cultivated coastal plains of the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean islands, and the Norse commanders were forced, therefore, to rely, for their concealment and their surprise, on a different set of the natural and the human features, the narrow, deeply indented, and cliff-bound coastal inlets, the Kala, that were invisible from the open sea, the sudden, dense, and disorienting sea fogs that rolled, without the warning, off the warm, Mediterranean waters, the small, isolated, and uninhabited offshore islands that could serve as the temporary, hidden bases for the fleet, and most importantly, the speed, the audacity, and the sheer, paralyzing psychological shock of the sudden daylight. An utterly unexpected amphibious assault on a coastal city that had, for centuries, considered itself safe, protected, and utterly beyond the reach of any seaborne enemy. The Viking raid on the great, Andalusian city of Seville in 844 CE, which the Arab chronicles describe as a sudden, terrifying, and almost apocalyptic eruption of the Magus, the fire-worshipping, pagan Northmen, was a masterclass of the amphibious, urban guerrilla warfare, a raid that used the surprise, the speed, and the concentrated, overwhelming violence to capture the undefended outer suburbs of the city, to massacre its inhabitants, and to lay siege to the central, walled citadel for a full week, a raid that was only, and barely, defeated by the desperate, last-minute mobilization of the Umayyad emir's professional, heavily armored, and mounted Andalusian army, a force that the Vikings, who were unfamiliar with the massed, shock cavalry of the Islamic world, could not, in the open field, effectively resist. The tactical, learning curve that the Vikings underwent during their Mediterranean campaigns was a steep, brutal, and deeply instructive process, a process that revealed both the extraordinary adaptive genius of the Norse guerrilla warrior and the ultimate, hard limits of the asymmetric, lightly armed, and terrain-dependent ambush tactics against a well-organized, heavily armored, and technologically sophisticated enemy. The Vikings, who had, in the north, learned to rely on the forest and the swamp as their primary, tactical weapons, found that the open, treeless, and sun-baked plains of the Andalusian countryside, the terrain of the olive grove and the wheat field, was a terrain that was perfectly suited to the massed, heavy cavalry charge of the Umayyad Jund, a terrain in which the lightly armed, foot-bound Norse raiders, caught, without the warning, far from their ships and their hidden, forest bases, were utterly vulnerable, and were, on several, disastrous occasions, annihilated, almost to the man, by the swift, coordinated, and utterly merciless Andalusian horsemen. The Viking chieftains, who were, above all, the pragmatists and the survivors, adapted, rapidly and decisively, to this new, and deeply unforgiving, tactical environment, adopting, in the later raids on the Balearic Islands and the Italian coast, a more cautious, a more speed-oriented, and a more strictly amphibious mode of the operation, a mode that minimized the time spent on the open, exposed, and cavalry-suitable terrain, a mode that relied, for the success of the raid, on the speed, the surprise, and the immediate, undisrupted withdrawal to the ship and the sea, a mode that was, in its essence, a return to the pure, classic, and ultra-mobile hit-and-run raid, the Strandhog, the tactic that the Vikings had perfected, centuries before, in the dark, misty fjords of their homeland, and that was, in the bright, alien, and deeply hostile light of the Mediterranean sun, their only, and their eternal, tactical salvation. The interaction between the Viking guerrilla warriors and the great, walled, and heavily fortified cities of the Frankish, the Anglo-Saxon, and the Islamic worlds was a prolonged, complex, and deeply asymmetrical strategic duel, a duel in which the Norse, who possessed neither the siege engines, the logistical infrastructure, nor the tactical doctrine to conduct a prolonged, conventional siege, were forced to rely, for the capture of these urban, economic fortresses, on the indirect, psychological, and terrain-based methods of the guerrilla, the blockade, the ambush of the relief columns, the interdiction of the supply lines, and the slow, grinding, and utterly merciless starvation of the civilian population. The siege of Paris in 885–886 CE, the most famous, and the most historically significant, of all the Viking urban operations, was, in its tactical and its strategic essence, not a siege in the conventional, classical sense but a prolonged, year-long guerrilla campaign, a campaign that was conducted, not from a fortified circumvallation of the besieging trenches and the towers, but from a network of the mobile, riverine bases, the hidden, forest camps, and the constantly shifting, opportunistic ambush positions that the Viking fleet, under the command of the chieftains Sigfred and Rollo, established and maintained, with a remarkable, and a deeply frustrating, strategic patience, throughout the entire, vast, and heavily wooded Seine Valley. The Frankish defenders of Paris, under the command of the Count Odo and the Bishop Goslin, were, throughout the long, desperate months of the siege, confined within the walls of their island city, their supply lines, the vital, riverine convoys of the grain and the provisions that were the city's only, and essential, lifeline, constantly, and increasingly effectively, ambushed, intercepted, and destroyed by the mobile, fast-moving, and deeply concealed Viking river raiders, a slow, methodical, and utterly merciless guerrilla strangulation that was, in the end, far more effective, and far more devastating, than any direct, frontal assault on the city's formidable, Roman-era walls could ever have been. The ultimate, strategic failure of the siege of Paris, The inability of the Viking fleet to capture the city and to break, permanently, the Frankish resistance, was a failure that was rooted not in the tactical or the psychological inferiority of the Norse guerrilla warriors but in the deep, structural, and ultimately insoluble logistical and the political limitations of the guerrilla mode of the warfare itself. The Viking army, which was, despite its formidable, tactical prowess, a temporary, coalition-based, and economically motivated raiding force, lacked the one, essential, and irreplaceable resource that the prolonged, strategic siege of a major, fortified city demanded: the time, the unlimited, patient, and politically uninterrupted time, and the stable, territorial base, that were the exclusive and the defining advantages of the settled, agrarian, and state-based societies that the Northmen were attacking. The Viking chieftains, who were, above all, the pragmatic, profit-seeking entrepreneurs of the raid, could not, and would not, sustain the prolonged, attritional, and economically unproductive siege of Paris indefinitely, a siege that consumed, without the prospect of the immediate, compensating plunder, their most precious, and their most finite, resource: the loyalty, the patience, and the lives of their felagar. The Frankish king, Charles the Fat, who arrived, at the head of a massive, imperial army, to relieve the city in the autumn of 886 CE, did not, in the end, defeat the Vikings in a pitched, climactic battle. He bought them off, with a massive, state-impoverishing payment of the silver and the permission to plunder the undefended, Burgundian countryside, a classic, and a deeply cynical resolution of the guerrilla siege that was, in its essence, a recognition, by both sides, of the fundamental and the ultimately stalemated, strategic reality. The Vikings could not take the city, and the Franks could not drive the Vikings away, a reality that was, in the final, historical analysis, the ultimate, and the permanent, strategic limitation of the Forest Phantom's hidden war. The long-term, strategic legacy of the Viking urban, guerrilla sieges was, however, far more significant, and far more historically transformative, than the immediate, tactical outcome of any single, specific operation. The constant, grinding, and utterly demoralizing threat of the Viking riverine blockade and the ambush of the supply convoys forced the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon kings and the urban, ecclesiastical elites to invest, on a massive, unprecedented, and economically transformative scale, in the fortification, the garrisoning, and the permanent, military defense of their major cities and their strategic riverine crossings, an investment that was, in its long-term, structural consequence, one of the primary, driving forces behind the emergence of the fortified, medieval, and eventually feudal, urban landscape of the 10th and the 11th centuries. The great, stone bridges of the Loire and the Seine, the massive, fortified Bas of Wessex, the rebuilt, and heavily garrisoned, Roman walls of the Rhenish and the Andalusian cities, all these were the direct, physical, and the permanent, architectural monuments to the long, grinding, and ultimately transformative impact of the Viking guerrilla war on the urban, and the political, civilization of the early medieval West. A war that, in its silent, invisible, and utterly lethal way, reshaped the very face, and the very structure of the continent. The interaction of the Viking guerrilla tactics with the unique, challenging, and deeply alien terrain of the Arctic and the subarctic regions of the Scandinavian homeland and the North Atlantic, a terrain of the vast, treeless, and windswept tundra, the immense, permanent ice caps, the narrow, precipitous, and deeply indented coastal fjords, and the dark, frozen, and utterly silent winter wilderness, was a process of the deep, ecological adaptation that forged the essential, physical, and the psychological characteristics of the forest phantom, and that endowed him with a set of the survival, the mobility, and the combat skills that were, in the more temperate and the heavily forested terrains of the continent, the source of his extraordinary, and his often decisive, tactical advantage. The Norse warrior who had learned, from his earliest childhood, to hunt the reindeer and the seal in the silent, white, and utterly featureless wilderness of the winter tundra, who had learned to navigate by the stars, the sun, and the subtle, almost invisible, coastal landmarks, the vast, treacherous, and constantly shifting labyrinth of the sea ice and the open water leads, who had learned to survive, for the days and the weeks, in the dark, frozen, and utterly inhospitable interior of the mountains, with only the knife, the fire steel, and the fur-lined, reindeer-skin sleeping bag, was, by the time he stepped onto the longship that would carry him to the lush, green, and fatally unprepared lands of the south, a man who possessed a set of the physical, the mental, and the observational skills, a degree of the self-reliance, the patience, and the silent, predatory endurance, that the soft, road-bound, and village-dwelling Frankish or Anglo-Saxon farmer, the primary, and the only, defender of the continental heartland, could not even begin to comprehend, let alone to effectively counter. The specific, Arctic guerrilla tactic of the Finn ski, the use of the long, narrow, and highly maneuverable wooden skis for the silent, rapid, and utterly undetectable movement across the vast, snow-covered expanses of the winter wilderness, was a skill that was, for the Norse hunters and the warriors of the northernmost regions of Norway and Sweden, the essential, and the life-saving mode of the transportation and the combat, a skill that the sagas record as being employed, with a devastating, and a deeply unsettling, effectiveness, in the inter-clan feuds and the ambushes of the dark, frozen, and snow-bound winter months. The ski-born warrior, who could glide, with a silent, ghostly, and effortless speed, across the surface of the deep, soft snow, a snow that would have trapped, immobilized, and fatally exhausted any foot-bound pursuer, was, in the context of the winter ambush, the ultimate, invisible, and utterly lethal predator, a predator who could strike, without the warning, from the white, featureless, and disorienting blizzard, who could outpace, and outmaneuver, any conventional, foot-bound or horse-mounted enemy, and who could vanish, in a matter of the moments, back into the silent, white, and impenetrable infinity of the Arctic wilderness, a wilderness that was, to the Norse hunter, a familiar, and a deeply loved, home, but which was, to the southern, Christian, and utterly unprepared invader, a vision of the frozen, and the eternal, hell. The influence of the Arctic guerrilla warfare on the broader, Viking campaign in Europe was not a direct, tactical transplantation. The snow-covered tundra of the Finnmark could not be replicated on the muddy, autumn fields of the Loire Valley, but an indirect, psychological, and the physiological preparation, a preparation that produced a warrior who was, by the standards of the early medieval, agricultural, and deeply sedentary world, a superhumanly resilient, adaptable, and self-sufficient specimen of the human, a man who could endure the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the constant, gnawing, psychological terror of the hidden, unseen enemy with a stoic, patient, and utterly unshakable fortitude that his enemies, the soft, hearth-bound, and village-dwelling farmers and the knights of the continent, could not, in the long, grinding, and attritional test of the guerrilla war, hope to match. The forest phantom, the silent, patient, and utterly lethal master of the ambush, was, in his deepest, and his most essential, nature, a creature of the Arctic wilderness, a creature who had been forged by the dark, frozen, and utterly unforgiving fire of the north, into a weapon of the survival, the adaptability, and the patient, silent, and utterly implacable violence that was, in the final historical analysis, the most potent, the most enduring, and the most terrifying of all the many, and the often contradictory, legacies of the Viking Age. The ultimate failure of the Carolingian and the Anglo-Saxon states to develop an effective, sustained, and institutionally resilient counterinsurgency doctrine against the Viking guerrilla war was not a failure of the individual, tactical or the strategic intelligence. The kings, the margraves, and the ealdormen of the 9th and the 10th centuries were, in many cases, the able, the energetic, and the deeply pragmatic military leaders, but a failure of the deep, structural, and the ultimately fatal mismatch between the political, the economic, and the social systems of the early medieval, agrarian state and the specific, and the deeply alien, demands of the prolonged, attritional, and utterly unconventional guerrilla conflict. The Carolingian Empire, for all its impressive, bureaucratic, and legal sophistication, was, at its core, a land-based, agricultural, and road-dependent state, a state whose military power was concentrated in the heavy, armored, and shock-oriented cavalry of the Skara, a force that was, in the open field, the most formidable, and the most feared weapon of the age, but which was, in the dense, pathless, and utterly hostile terrain of the forest and the swamp, a clumsy, vulnerable, and strategically useless anachronism, a magnificent, and a deeply expensive, white elephant that consumed, in its constant, futile, and exhausting pursuit of the phantom, vanishing raiders, the very resources, the grain, the silver, and the loyal manpower, that were the essential, and the irreplaceable, foundation of the imperial, political order. The fundamental, and the ultimately insoluble, strategic dilemma of the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon defenders was the dilemma of the defense of the entire, vast, and deeply penetrable coastline and the riverine interior, a perimeter that was, in the aggregate, thousands of the miles long, a perimeter that was, at every single point, at every remote, isolated, and undefended monastery, at every small, vulnerable, and unfortified river mouth, potentially, and unpredictably, subject to the sudden, devastating, and utterly unanswerable Viking hit-and-run raid. The defender, who was forced by the logic of the guerrilla war to be strong everywhere, and at all the times, was, in the end, strong nowhere, and at no time, a dispersion of the limited, military and the economic resources that was, in the face of the mobile, concentrated, and strategically opportunistic Viking offensive, a formula for the slow grinding, and the ultimately fatal exhaustion. The great, fortified battles of Alfred, which were the most successful, and the most widely imitated, counterinsurgency measure of the age were, in their essence, a brilliant, and a deeply pragmatic, admission of this fundamental, strategic dilemma, an admission that the state could not, and should not, attempt to defend the entire, vulnerable periphery but should, instead, concentrate its limited defensive resources on a network of the strong, garrisoned, and mutually supporting fortified points that could serve as the refuges for the local population and the bases for the mobile, counter-raiding forces, a strategy of the defense in the depth that was, in its essence, a carbon copy, a mirror image, of the Vikings' own, VTR setter-based, guerrilla strategy, a strategy that turned the tables on the forest phantoms and that, in the end, over the long, patient, and utterly remorseless course of the 10th century, ground them into the dust of the English earth. The ultimate, and the most historically consequential, counterinsurgency strategy that the Frankish and the Anglo-Saxon states employed against the Viking guerrilla threat was not, however, the purely military measure but the political, the cultural, and the religious co-option, the assimilation, and the integration of the Norse raiders into the fabric of the Christian, feudal, and territorial European order. A process that was exemplified, most famously, and most successfully, by the Treaty of St. Clair sur Epte in 911 C, in which the Viking chieftain Rollo was granted the land, the title, and the political legitimacy of the Duchy of Normandy, in return for his conversion to Christianity and his oath of the feudal loyalty to the Frankish king, a treaty that transformed the most dangerous, and the most persistent, of the Viking guerrilla threats into a permanent, stable, and eventually deeply loyal component of the Frankish, and later the French, political and military system. The Normans, the descendants of Rollo's Fellig, would, within a few generations, abandon the hit-and-run, the hidden war, and the portable scale of their pagan, guerrilla ancestors, and would, instead, become the most formidable, the most innovative, and the most aggressively expansionist of the feudal, cavalry-based, and castle-building warriors of the medieval West, a transformation that was, in its ultimate historical irony, the final, and the most complete, victory of the settled territorial and Christian order over the wild, ecstatic, and predatory chaos of the wolf pack. The forest phantom, the silent, patient, and utterly lethal master of the hidden war, was, in the end, not defeated, but assimilated, not annihilated, but transformed, a transformation that was the final, the most profound, and the most enduring of the many, complex and contradictory legacies of the Viking Age. The archaeological signature of the Viking ambush, the physical, material traces that the forest phantoms left in the soil, the sediment, and the landscape of the European continent, is a subtle, fragmentary, and deeply elusive record, a record that is, by its very nature, the antithesis of the massive, permanent, and highly visible fortifications of the settled, agrarian states, and that requires, for its detection and its interpretation, a combination of the painstaking, scientific excavation, the careful, geospatial analysis, and the empathetic, historical imagination that is the hallmark of the modern, interdisciplinary archaeology of the conflict. The temporary, hidden forest camps of the Viking raiders, the Skogar bear, which were constructed from the perishable, and the now utterly decayed, materials of the wood, the turf, and the leaf thatch, have left, for the most part, no identifiable, physical trace on the modern, heavily altered, and intensively farmed European landscape, a silence, an invisibility, that is, in itself, a powerful, and a deeply evocative, testament to the extraordinary, and the deeply unsettling, field craft, and the camouflage skills of the Norse guerrilla, a skill that allowed a force of the hundreds, or even the thousands, of the warriors, to live, to operate, and to prepare the devastating, and the utterly unexpected ambush, in the heart of the enemy territory, for the months at a time, without leaving a single, detectable, and archaeologically recoverable, footprint. However, the more permanent, and the more physically destructive, of the Viking guerrilla tactics, particularly the traps, the pitfalls, and the engineered, defensive obstacles, have, on a small, and the deeply precious, number of the archaeological sites, left the direct, material, and the scientifically verifiable traces that confirm, in the most vivid, and the most chilling, way, the technical, and the psychological, sophistication of the Norse hidden war. The excavation of the Viking winter camp at Repton in Derbyshire, the site of the great army's VTR Shatter of 873-874 CE, has revealed, in addition to the mass grave of the 249 individuals and the fragments of the portable scales and the hacked, silver dirhams, a deep, massive, and archaeologically complex ditch, and the earthen rampart that was, in part, constructed from the material of the desecrated Anglo-Saxon royal mausoleum, a fortification that was, in its design and its construction, a classic, and a deeply formidable, example of the S-style, guerrilla defensive obstacle, an obstacle that was designed to channel the pursuing, enemy force into a narrow, constricted, and pre-ranged killing ground, a ground that was, as the mass grave of the Ridgeway Hill execution victims so grimly testifies, used, on at least one, fatal occasion, to annihilate a group of the captured, or the mutinous Vikings themselves. The Repton Ditch, which is, to the modern, archaeological eye, a massive, and a deeply impressive, feat of the military engineering, is the physical, and the permanent, monument to the hidden, and the often overlooked, defensive, and the trap-building dimension of the Viking guerrilla war, a dimension that was as essential, as lethal, and as psychologically devastating as the more celebrated, and the more mobile, ambush tactics. The analysis of the human remains from the execution graves, such as the mass grave at Ridgeway Hill and the decapitated skeletons from the Weymouth Bay site, has provided the most direct, the most intimate, and the most chillingly personal insight into the fate of the Viking guerrillas who were captured, and who were subjected, by their enemies, to the full, ritualized, and utterly merciless retribution of the counterinsurgency war. The osteological, and the isotopic, analysis of the skeletal remains has revealed that the executed men were, in the vast majority, the young, the fit, and the previously healthy warriors, men whose bones bore the characteristic, and the often horrific, scars of the repeated, violent trauma, the healed, sword-cut fractures, the embedded, iron arrowheads, and the defensive, forearm parry wounds that were the permanent, physical hallmarks of the professional, and the deeply experienced guerrilla fighter. The forensic reconstruction of the decapitation process, the specific, and the deeply disturbing, pattern of the sword cuts on the cervical vertebrae, has shown that the executions were not the chaotic, panicked acts of the battlefield vengeance but the cold, deliberate, and the ritualized, judicial killings, the thing verdicts of the enraged, and the deeply traumatized, local community or the victorious. And the utterly merciless, enemy king, a grim, and a deeply sobering, final chapter in the long, and the bitter, history of the hidden war, a chapter that is written, in the silent, bone-white, and utterly irreparable testimony of the dead, on the very bodies of the forest phantoms themselves. The enduring legacy of the Viking guerrilla warfare in the military history of the medieval and the modern worlds is a legacy that is as profound, as pervasive, and as consistently underestimated as the forest phantoms themselves, a legacy that is encoded, not in the formal, military manuals or the theoretical treatises of the medieval West, for the Christian, chivalric, and classically educated military writers of the later Middle Ages were, by their culture and their training, deeply hostile to the very concept of the irregular, the hidden, and the socially subversive war of the guerrilla, but in the practical, the adaptive, and the deeply effective counterinsurgency and the irregular warfare traditions of the frontier, the borderland, and the colonial conquest, traditions that were, in many cases, the direct, and the often unacknowledged, descendants of the Viking hit and run, the ambush, and the terrain-based, ecologically intelligent mode of the combat. The Norman knights who conquered England in 1066 were, after all, the direct, genetic and the cultural descendants of Rollo's Felagar, men whose ancestors had, only a few generations before, been the masters of the hidden, forest war and the riverine ambush, and who had, in the interim, learned to fuse that ancient, predatory skill with the heavy, shock cavalry and the castle-based territorial domination of the Frankish feudal system, a fusion that was, in its military and its political consequence, one of the most successful and the most transformative adaptations of the guerrilla legacy in the entire history of the warfare. The broader and the more diffuse influence of the Viking guerrilla tradition on the warfare of the later medieval period is visible, not in the specific, tactical doctrine of any single European army, but in the persistent and the deeply effective, irregular, and the ambush-based resistance that the lightly armed, the locally rooted, and the terrain-adapted peasant and the frontier communities of the European periphery, the Welsh and the Scottish bowmen of the hill and the forest, the Basque, and the Alpine mountaineers, the Irish kern of the bog and the wood, were able to mount, for the centuries, against the invading, the heavily armored, and the road-bound armies of the centralizing, feudal states. The ghost of the forest phantom, the silent, patient, and utterly lethal master of the hidden war, hovered, invisibly, over every narrow, forested defile of the medieval European conflict, over every sudden, devastating ambush of the supply train and the relief column, over every long, grinding, and ultimately successful guerrilla resistance that was waged, by the weak against the strong, by the few against the many, by the native, the dispossessed, and the desperate, against the arrogant, the well-fed, and the heavily armored invader, a ghost that was, and remains, the permanent, and the utterly unacknowledged, tactical and the psychological inheritance of the Viking Age. The final, and the most historically profound, legacy of the Viking guerrilla war is, however, not the purely military but the deeply political and the cultural, a legacy that is encoded in the very structure of the modern, Western, and deeply paradoxical relationship with the concept of the asymmetric, the irregular, and the hidden warfare. The modern, Western military, which is, in its technological and its organizational essence, the heir of the Alfredian, the Carolingian, and the imperial, state-based, heavy infantry, and the shock cavalry tradition, has, for the centuries, struggled with the deep, and a recurrently tragic, institutional and the psychological difficulty to understand, to counter, and to defeat the guerrilla, the partisan, and the irregular insurgent, a difficulty that is, in its essence, a reincarnation of the Frankish knight's terrified, uncomprehending, and utterly fatal blunder into the dark, silent, and deeply lethal forest of the Ardennes, a difficulty that is, in its deepest, and its most stubbornly persistent, root, the permanent, and the unhealed, psychological scar of the Viking Age. The forest phantom, the silent, patient, and utterly remorseless master of the hidden war, is not, therefore, a figure of the distant, barbaric, and safely academic past. He is a permanent, and a deeply unsettling, presence in the modern, military and the political subconscious, a presence that is summoned, every time a great, conventional, and technologically superior army is bled, humiliated, and ultimately defeated, in the dark, silent, and utterly unforgiving terrain of the guerrilla, a presence that is the eternal, and the eternal, warning from the north.